Chapter 1. The Quiet Village. The village of St. Mary's Hollow lay nestled in a crook of the English countryside, where rolling hills met whispering woods, and time seemed to have paused somewhere in the early 20th century. Its cobbled streets, lined with ivy-draped cottages, gleamed under the soft September sun, and the air carried the faint scent of wood smoke and freshly baked bread. To an outsider, it was the picture of pastoral serenity, a place where nothing ever happened, and, if it did, it was never more dramatic than a misplaced cow or a heated debate over the church flower arrangements. But to those who lived there, St. Mary's Hollow was a tapestry of secrets, woven so tightly that even the sharpest eyes might miss the threads. At the heart of the village stood the Green Willow Inn, a squat, timber-framed building with a sagging roof and windows that seemed to squint at passers-by. It was the kind of place where locals gathered not just for ale, but for the currency of gossip, traded in hushed tones over polished oak tables. On this particular morning, the inn was quieter than usual, the only sound the faint clink of glasses, being wiped by the barkeep, Tom Harrow. Tom was a man of few words, his broad shoulders and weathered face giving him the look of someone who had seen more than he cared to share. He glanced out the window, his eyes narrowing as a figure hurried past. A woman in a grey shawl, her head bowed against the morning chill. Odd that, Tom muttered to himself, his cloth pausing mid-swipe. The woman was Eliza Crane, the village seamstress known for her meticulous stitches and her equally meticulous avoidance of company. She wasn't one to be out this early, and certainly not moving with such purpose. Tom's gaze lingered on the empty street, a prickle of unease stirring in his chest. Something was off, though he couldn't put a finger on it. Not yet. Beyond the inn, the village was waking slowly. The bakery, run by the perpetually flustered Mrs. Pym, was already sending plumes of flowery warmth into the air, while the blacksmith's hammer rang out in a steady rhythm from the edge of the square. Children scampered toward the schoolhouse, their laughter bright but fleeting, as if the village itself absorbed sound into its ancient stones. And yet there was a tension in the air, a subtle tightening of the atmosphere that no one could quite name. It was as if St. Mary's Hollow was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. At the northern end of the village, where the road curved toward the grand but crumbling Haverford Manor, a young man named Daniel Wren stood outside his family's modest cottage, staring at the horizon. Daniel was 23, with sharp green eyes and a restless energy that set him apart from the other villagers. He was the kind of person who noticed things, small things, like the way the wind shifted before a storm, or the way someone's smile didn't quite reach their eyes. Today, his attention was fixed on the manor, its silhouette looming against the pale sky like a sleeping giant. He didn't know why, but the sight of it made his stomach twist. "Daniel!" called a voice from inside the cottage. It was his mother, Margaret, her tone sharp with impatience. "Stop dawdling! The market won't wait." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his dark hair. "Coming," he called back. But his eyes lingered on the manor a moment longer. He'd heard the stories, of course, everyone had. Haverford Manor was home to the reclusive Lord Edwin Haverford, a man so rarely seen that some villagers swore he was a ghost. Others said he was merely eccentric, hoarding his wealth and his secrets behind those iron gates. Daniel had never met the man, but he'd seen the manor's groundskeeper, a hulking figure named Silas, who moved through the village like a shadow, speaking to no one. There was something about Silas that made Daniel's skin crawl, though he couldn't say why. As Daniel turned to head inside, a flicker of movement caught his eye, a figure slipping through the manor's gates, too quick to identify. He froze, his heart kicking up a notch. It wasn't Silas. The shape was too slight, too hurried. He squinted, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the overgrown hedges. For a moment he considered following, but the sound of his mother's voice, louder now, edged with irritation, pulled him back. The morning wore on, and St. Mary's Hollow settled into its usual rhythm, or at least the appearance of it. In the village square, the market was in full swing, with stalls laden with apples, cheeses, and bolts of cloth. Women haggled with practised ease, their voices mingling with the clatter of carts and the occasional bleat of a goat. But beneath the bustle, there were glances, quick, furtive looks exchanged between neighbours, as if each was trying to gauge what the other knew. Eliza Crane, the seamstress, was there, her grey shawl pulled tight around her shoulders. She stood at the edge of the market, her fingers twisting the handle of her basket. Her eyes darted toward the manor, then away, as if she feared being caught looking. No one approached her, though several villagers noticed her presence. Mrs. Pym, pausing to wipe flour from her hands, muttered to her neighbour, "Eliza's not herself today. Mark my words, something's brewing." The neighbour, a wiry man named Mr. Gibbs, nodded sagely. "Always is, with that lot up at the manor. Never trusted 'em, not since the old lord died." Their conversation was cut short by the arrival of a stranger, a rare occurrence in St. Mary's Hollow. He was a tall man, perhaps in his 40s, with a lean face and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His coat was well cut but slightly worn, suggesting a man of means who had fallen on harder times. He carried a leather satchel, and his steps were measured, as if he were in no hurry to announce his purpose. The villagers watched him with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion, their chatter faltering as he passed. The stranger made his way to the Green Willow Inn, where Tom Harrow was still behind the bar, his cloth now abandoned on the counter. The man entered without a word, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Tom. "Good morning," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge that made Tom's shoulders stiffen. "I'm looking for a place to stay. A week, perhaps longer." Tom studied the man, noting the faint lines of tension around his mouth, the way his fingers tightened briefly on the satchel. "Got a room upstairs," Tom said at last. 3 shillings a night, meals extra. Name? Carter." The stranger replied. "James Carter." He offered no more, and Tom didn't press. In a village like St. Mary's Hollow, questions were rarely asked outright. They were answered in time, whether you wanted them to be or not. As Carter settled into a corner table, the inn's door swung open again, admitting a gust of cool air and a woman whose presence seemed to shift the room's gravity. She was elderly, with silver hair pinned neatly beneath a sensible hat, and eyes that sparkled with a quiet, almost mischievous intelligence. Her dress was modest, her posture impeccable, and though she carried a small handbag, it was the weight of her gaze that drew attention. This was no ordinary visitor, though few in the village would have recognized her yet. Miss Marple," Tom said, a note of surprise in his voice. He'd met her once, years ago, when she'd passed through on her way to visit a niece. She'd left an impression, not because of anything she said, but because of the way she listened, as if every word held a clue to some greater puzzle. "Good morning, Mr. Harrow," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but clear. "I trust you're well." "Well enough," Tom replied, wiping his hands on his apron. "What brings you back?" "Oh, a little holiday," Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. "I've always found St. Mary's Hollow so restful." But her eyes, sharp and searching, suggested anything but rest. They flicked toward Carter, who was pretending not to notice her, then back to Tom. "I'll take tea, if you please, and perhaps a word with you later." Tom nodded, sensing the weight behind her request. As he turned to fetch the tea, he couldn't shake the feeling that the village's quiet days were numbered. Miss Marple's arrival, like the stranger's, was no coincidence. Something was coming, something dark, something that would unravel the threads of St. Mary's Hollow and expose what lay beneath. By midday, the village was abuzz with speculation. The presence of two outsiders was enough to set tongues wagging, but it was the smaller details that fueled the fire. Eliza Crane's hurried steps, Daniel Wren's lingering glances at the manor, the way Silas, the groundskeeper, had been seen, lurking near the churchyard at dawn. No one spoke of it openly, but the pieces were there, scattered like leaves on the wind. Daniel, now at the market with his mother, couldn't stop thinking about the figure he'd seen at the manor gates. He'd mentioned it to no one, not even Margaret, who was too busy haggling over a sack of potatoes to notice his distraction. But as he scanned the crowd, his eyes landed on Eliza Crane, and for a moment their gazes locked. There was something in her expression, fear, perhaps, or guilt, that made his pulse quicken. She looked away quickly, but not before he saw her. Hand tremble. "Daniel, what's got into you?" Margaret snapped, following his gaze. "You're miles away." "Nothing," he lied, forcing a smile. But his mind was racing. He'd always been good at puzzles, at seeing patterns where others saw only chaos, and right now St. Mary's Hollow was a puzzle begging to be solved. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the village, the Green Willow Inn grew crowded. Locals filed in, their voices low but urgent, each bringing their own piece of the day's unease. Tom Harrow listened, as he always did, his face impassive but his mind sharp. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her tea untouched, her knitting needles clicking softly as she watched the room. Carter, the stranger, remained in his corner, his satchel never far from his side. And outside, in the gathering dusk, the manor stood, silent, its windows dark but watchful. No one knew it yet, but the first thread had been pulled. By morning, St. Mary's Hollow would be a different place, a place where secrets could no longer hide, and where the truth, when it came, would be darker than anyone could imagine. Chapter 2. An Unexpected Guest. The evening descended on St. Mary's Hollow like a velvet curtain, softening the edges of the village but sharpening its secrets. The Green Willow Inn was alive with the hum of voices, the clink of tankards, and the occasional burst of laughter, though even that carried a nervous edge. The villagers had gathered, as they often did, to trade stories and suspicions. But tonight the air was thick with something unspoken. A collective awareness that the arrival of two strangers had tilted the village's delicate balance. Miss Jane Marple sat near the fire, her knitting needles moving with a rhythm that belied the keen attention she paid to every word, every glance. Across the room, James Carter, the man who had introduced himself that morning, nursed a glass of whiskey, his eyes fixed on the grain of the table as if it held answers he couldn't yet decipher. Tom Harrow, the barkeep, moved with practised ease, filling glasses and wiping spills, but his gaze kept drifting to Miss Marple. He hadn't forgotten her request for a word later, and the weight of it sat heavy on his shoulders. Tom was no stranger to the village's undercurrents. He'd heard the whispers about Haverford Manor, the rumours of hidden wealth and darker deeds. But Miss Marple's presence suggested something more. She wasn't here for a holiday, no matter what she claimed. Her eyes, bright and unyielding, missed nothing, and Tom had the uneasy sense that she was already piecing together a puzzle he couldn't even see. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the inn's leaded windows and sending a chill through the room. The door swung open, admitting a gust of cold air and a figure that made every head turn. It was Silas, the manor's groundskeeper, his massive frame filling the doorway. His face was shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, and his coat, patched and worn, hung loose on his broad shoulders. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the stares, but moved to the bar with a slow, deliberate gait that seemed to command silence. The room's chatter faltered, then resumed, though quieter now, as if the villagers were afraid to draw his attention. "Usual," Silas grunted, his voice low and gravelly. Tom nodded, pouring a measure of dark ale without comment. Silas took the glass and retreated to a corner where he sat alone, his eyes scanning the room with a predator's patience. Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment, her gaze flicking toward him before returning to her knitting. She noted the way his fingers tightened around the glass, the way his shoulders remained tense, as if ready to spring. A man like Silas, she thought, carried secrets as heavy as the earth he worked. Daniel Wren was there too, leaning against the bar with a pint he barely touched. His green eyes darted between Silas and the stranger, Carter, his mind still churning over the figure he'd seen at the manor gates that morning. He hadn't told anyone, not at even his mother, but the image was burned into his memory. A slight, hurried shape, cloaked in shadow. He'd convinced himself it was nothing, a trick of the light perhaps, but Silas's presence tonight felt like a confirmation that something was amiss. Daniel's fingers tapped restlessly against the bar, drawing a sharp look from Tom. "Easy, lad," Tom murmured, wiping a glass. "You're wound tighter than a spring." Daniel forced a grin, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Just thinking," he said, his voice low. "You ever wonder about the manor? What goes on up there?" Tom's cloth slowed, his expression unreadable. "Best not to wonder too much," he said after a pause. "Some doors are better left closed." But Daniel wasn't listening. His gaze had shifted to Eliza Crane, who had slipped into the inn just moments after Silas. She stood near the door, her grey shawl clutched tightly, her face pale in the firelight. She hadn't joined the others, hadn't even approached the bar, but her eyes were fixed on Silas with an intensity that made Daniel's skin prickle. He opened his mouth to say something, to Tom, to anyone, but a sudden commotion at the door cut him off. The inn's door banged open, and a woman stumbled in, her breath coming in sharp gasps. She was young, no more than 30, with dark hair plastered to her face by the rain that had begun to fall outside. Her coat was soaked, her boots caked with mud, and her eyes, wide and wild, darted around the room as if searching for salvation. The villagers froze, their conversations dying mid-sentence. Even Silas straightened, his glass pausing halfway to his lips. "Help!" the woman whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, someone's dead!" The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples of shock through the room. Miss Marple's needles stilled, her hands folding neatly in her lap as she leaned forward, her expression one of quiet alertness. Carter's head snapped up, his whiskey forgotten, while Daniel took an involuntary step toward the woman, his heart pounding. Tom was the first to move, rounding the bar with a speed that belied his bulk. "Who's dead?" he demanded, his voice steady but urgent. "What happened?" The woman swayed, clutching the edge of a table for support. "At the manor," she gasped. "I saw blood, so much blood. He's gone." "Who?" Tom pressed, his hand on her arm to keep her upright. "Who's gone?" "Lord Haverford," she whispered, and the name seemed to suck the air from the room. "He's dead. Murdered." A murmur swept through the inn, low and electric, as the villagers processed the impossible. Lord Edwin Haverford, the reclusive master of Haverford Manor, was dead. The man who hadn't been seen in years, whose very existence was half myth, to the younger generation, was gone. It was unthinkable, and yet the woman's terror was undeniable. Her name, Daniel realized with a start, was Clara Ashbourne, a maid at the manor, rarely seen in the village, but known for her quiet demeanour. She didn't seem quiet now. She looked like she'd seen the devil himself. Miss Marple rose, her movements slow and deliberate, and approached Clara with a gentleness that calmed the room. "My dear," she said softly, "you've had a terrible shock. Sit, please. Tell us exactly what you saw." Clara allowed herself to be guided to a chair, her hands trembling as she clutched Miss Marple's offered handkerchief. The villagers crowded closer, their curiosity outweighing their manners, but Miss Marple's presence held them at bay. She knelt beside Clara, her eyes kind but searching, and waited. "It was tonight," Clara began, her voice unsteady. "I was in the manor, finishing my duties. The house was quiet, too quiet, I thought, but I didn't dwell on it. Lord Haverford kept to himself, you know. I was in the west wing, near his study, when I heard a sound. A thud, like something heavy falling. I thought he'd dropped a book or, I don't know. I called out, but there was no answer." She paused, swallowing hard, and Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "Go on, my dear." "I went to the study," Clara continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The door was ajar, and there was a smell like iron. I pushed it open, and there he was, Lord Haverford on the floor, his eyes open but empty. Blood everywhere, pooling under him. A knife in his chest, the handle carved with some kind of symbol. I screamed, I think. I don't remember. I just ran. I ran all the way here." The room was silent now. The only sound the crackle of the fire and the distant howl of the wind. Daniel's mind raced, picturing the scene Clara described. A knife with a carved handle. A symbol. It was specific, too specific to be random. He glanced at Silas, expecting some reaction. But the groundskeeper's face was a mask, his eyes fixed on Clara with an intensity that made Daniel's stomach churn. Miss Marple's voice broke the silence, calm but firm. "You did the right thing coming here," she said. "Now, Clara, think carefully. Did you see anyone else in the manor? Anyone at all?" Clara shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "No one. The house was empty, or so I thought. But there was something. On the desk, near his body. A piece of paper, folded with a wax seal. I didn't touch it, but it looked important." "A letter?" Miss Marple asked, her tone deceptively casual. "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I was too scared to look closely. I just wanted to get out." Miss Marple patted her hand, her mind already turning over the details. A knife with a symbol, a sealed letter, a locked manor with no witnesses, except perhaps the figure Daniel had seen that morning. She glanced at him as if sensing his thoughts, and Daniel felt a jolt of recognition. She knew something, or at least suspected it. But what? Tom took charge, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Right, we need to fetch Constable Reed. Someone, run to his cottage now." He looked at Daniel, who nodded and bolted for the door, grateful for something to do. The crowd parted for him, their faces a blur of shock and suspicion. As Daniel disappeared into the night, Carter slipped from his corner, his satchel slung over his shoulder. "I'll go with him," he said, his voice clipped. "Might be useful to have another pair of eyes." No one argued, though Tom's gaze followed him with a frown. Carter's sudden willingness to help felt calculated. Silas remained where he was, his ale untouched now, his presence a dark anchor in the room. Eliza Crane, still near the door, hadn't moved, but her eyes were no longer on Silas. They were on Clara, and the fear in them had deepened to something closer to panic. Miss Marple noticed her lips pursing slightly, but she said nothing. Instead she turned back to Clara, her voice soothing. "You're safe here," she said. "Rest now. We'll sort this out." But Clara's eyes were haunted, and Miss Marple knew that rest was the last thing any of them would find tonight. The murder of Lord Haverford was no isolated act. It was the first note in a symphony of secrets, and St. Mary's Hollow was about to become its stage. As the fire cast flickering shadows on the walls, Miss Marple's mind began to weave the threads together. Clara's terror, Silas's silence, Eliza's fear, Daniel's curiosity, Carter's secrecy, and somewhere in the dark heart of Haverford Manor, a killer waited, their next move already in motion. The night was young, and the village was no longer quiet. The game had begun, and Miss Marple, with her unassuming smile and relentless mind, was ready to play. Chapter 3. Whispers in the Shadows. The rain had thickened into a relentless downpour by the time Daniel Wren and James Carter reached Constable Reed's cottage, a squat stone building on the edge of St. Mary's Hollow. The wind howled through, the trees bending their branches into clawing shapes, and the night seemed to pulse with a life of its own. Daniel's boots sank into the mud, his breath visible in the cold, while Carter moved with a strange, almost mechanical precision, his satchel clutched tightly under his arm. The village felt like a different place now, its cosy familiarity stripped away by Clara Ashbourne's words. Lord Haverford, murdered. The impossible had happened, and the weight of it pressed against Daniel's chest like a stone. Constable. Reed was a wiry man in his late 50s, with a perpetually furrowed brow and a moustache that seemed to bristle with disapproval. He was pulling on his coat when Daniel burst through the door, Carter a step behind. "What's this nonsense about Haverford?" Reed barked, his voice sharp but laced with unease. He'd been roused from a rare evening by the fire, and the interruption didn't sit well. "No nonsense," Daniel said, catching his breath. "Clara Ashbourne ran into the inn, said she found him in his study, stabbed, blood everywhere. She's terrified, says it's murder." Reed's eyes narrowed, flicking to Carter, who stood silently by the door, water dripping from his coat. "And you are?" "James Carter," the stranger replied, his tone clipped but polite. "Just arrived today. Thought I'd lend a hand." Reed grunted, clearly unimpressed. "Right, stay out of the way then. This is village business." He grabbed his lantern and a battered notebook, then gestured for Daniel to lead. "Let's move. If Clara's right, we've got a mess on our hands." The trio set off towards Haverford Manor, the rain lashing their faces as they crossed the village square. Daniel's mind raced, replaying Clara's story. The knife with the carved handle, the sealed letter, the empty manor house. He glanced at Carter, whose expression was unreadable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. There was something about the man, too calm, too controlled, that set Daniel's nerves on edge. Why had he been so quick to join them? And what was in that satchel he guarded so fiercely? Back at the Green Willow Inn, the atmosphere had shifted, from shock to a restless, buzzing tension. The villagers had formed tight knots, their voices low but urgent, each trying to make sense of the unthinkable. Clara Ashbourne sat by the fire, a blanket draped over her shoulders, her hands still trembling as she clutched Miss Marple's handkerchief. Miss Marple herself had resumed her knitting, the soft click of her needles a steady counterpoint to the chaos around her. But her eyes were everywhere, on Clara, on Silas, on Eliza Crane, who had retreated to a shadowy corner near the door, her face half hidden by her shawl. Tom Harrow moved through the crowd, refilling glasses and calming tempers, but his own unease was evident in the tightness of his jaw. He'd seen plenty in his years behind the bar, brawls, betrayals, even the occasional theft. But murder? That was something else entirely. And in St. Mary's Hollow, where everyone knew everyone else's business, the idea of a killer hiding among them was a poison seeping into the village's veins. "Tom," Miss Marple called softly, her voice cutting through the din. He approached her table, wiping his hands on his apron. "Might I have that word now?" Tom nodded, glancing around to ensure no one was listening too closely. He pulled up a chair, lowering his voice. "What's on your mind, Miss Marple? You've got that look, like you're seeing things the rest of us ain't." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Oh, I'm only an old woman with too much time to think," she said, her tone disarming. "But I couldn't help noticing a few things tonight. Clara's story, for instance. It's quite Detailed, isn't it? The knife, the letter, the blood, almost as if she'd had time to study the scene before she ran. Tom frowned, his brow creasing. You think she's lying? Not lying, perhaps, Miss Marple said carefully. But there's more to her story than she's told us. And then there's Silas. Her gaze flicked toward the groundskeeper, who sat alone, his ale untouched, his eyes fixed on some distant point. He's not surprised, Tom. Shocked, perhaps, but not surprised. A man like that knows more than he lets on. Tom leaned back, his mind turning over her words. He'd always trusted his instincts, and they were screaming now. About Silas, about Clara, about the whole cursed manor. And the stranger Carter? He asked. What do you make of him? Miss Marple's needles paused, her expression thoughtful. Mr. Carter is a man with a purpose, she said. He's not here by chance, Tom. That satchel of his, he guards it like a treasure. And his eyes, they're the eyes of a man who's seen trouble before. Tom nodded slowly, his unease deepening. What do you reckon we do? For now, we watch, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but firm. And we listen. The truth has a way of slipping out, especially in a place like this. As Tom returned to the bar, Miss Marple's attention shifted to Eliza Crane. The seamstress had been silent all evening, her presence almost ghostly. But now she was edging toward the door, her movements quick and furtive. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. Eliza was afraid. Of what or whom? And why had she been watching Silas so intently earlier? There was a thread here, thin but vital, and Miss Marple intended to follow it. At Haverford Manor, the scene was as grim as Clara had described. Constable Reed's lantern cast harsh shadows across the study, illuminating Lord Edwin Haverford's body sprawled on the floor, his once impeccable suit soaked with blood. The knife protruded from his chest, its handle indeed carved with an intricate symbol, a circle bisected by a crescent moon, etched in silver. Daniel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the rain. The room was opulent but cold, its walls lined with books and portraits, its air heavy with the metallic tang of blood. Reed crouched beside the body, his notebook open, his pencil scratching furiously. No sign of a struggle, he muttered. No broken furniture, no scratches on him. Whoever did this was quick and close. Daniel's eyes scanned the room, landing on the desk Clara had mentioned. There it was, a folded piece of paper, sealed with red wax. The seal bore the same symbol as the knife, a circle and crescent moon. He pointed it out to Reed, who grunted and carefully lifted the letter, turning it over in his gloved hands. Don't touch anything, Reed warned, though Daniel hadn't moved. This is evidence. Carter, standing near the doorway, was silent, but his eyes were everywhere. On the body, the knife, the letter. Daniel watched him closely, noting the way his fingers twitched, as if itching to open that satchel. Strange symbol, Carter said at last, his voice casual. Not one you see every day. Reed shot him a look. You know something about it. Carter shrugged, his expression neutral. Just an observation. Looks old, maybe ceremonial. Daniel's stomach twisted. Carter's tone was too smooth, too practiced. He was hiding something. But what? And why was he here, in the middle of a murder scene, acting like he belonged? Reed tucked the letter into an evidence bag, then turned his attention to the rest of the room. "Clara said the house was empty," he said, "but we need to search it, top to bottom. If the killer's still here, we'll find them." The manor was a labyrinth of shadowed corridors and locked doors, its silence broken only by the creak of floorboards and the distant drip of rain through a broken window. Daniel and Carter followed Reed, their lanterns casting flickering pools of light. Every room seemed to hold a secret. Dusty portraits with eyes that followed, furniture draped in sheets, clocks frozen at odd hours. Daniel's imagination ran wild, picturing the figure he'd seen at the gates, wondering if they were still here, watching from the shadows. In the east wing, they found something that stopped them cold. A door, hidden behind a tapestry, its lock freshly broken. Reed pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. The air was damp, heavy with the scent of earth and something sharper. Decay, perhaps, or something worse. Daniel's heart pounded as Reed raised his lantern, the light catching on cobwebs and stone walls. "What is this place?" Daniel whispered, his voice barely audible. Reed didn't answer, but his face was grim. "Stay close," he said, starting down the stairs. Carter followed, his satchel now slung across his back, his movements silent but purposeful. Daniel hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to turn back, but curiosity and the need to know pulled him forward. The staircase led to a chamber, its walls carved with the same circle and crescent symbol they'd seen on the knife and letter. In the centre stood a stone table, stained with dark, irregular patches that made Daniel's stomach lurch. Shelves lined the walls, holding jars of unidentifiable substances, books with cracked leather bindings, and a single candle, its wax melted into a grotesque shape. This wasn't just a cellar. It was a shrine, a place where something ancient and terrible had been nurtured. "God in heaven," Reed muttered, his lantern trembling slightly. What was Haverford into? Carter's voice was low, almost a whisper. Something he shouldn't have been. Daniel's eyes locked on a book on the table, its cover embossed with the now familiar symbol. He reached for it, but Reed's hand shot out, stopping him. "I said don't touch!" the constable snapped, though his voice cracked with unease. "We're out of our depth here." Back at the inn, Miss Marple had noticed Eliza's departure. The seamstress had slipped out during the chaos, her shawl pulled tight, her steps quick and silent. Miss Marple set her knitting aside, her mind racing. Eliza was a piece of the puzzle, but how did she fit? And why had she been so afraid of Silas? The groundskeeper was still there, his presence a dark weight in the room. But now Miss Marple noticed something new, a faint bulge in his coat pocket, the shape of something small but heavy. A key, perhaps, or something more dangerous. Clara, meanwhile, had calmed slightly, thanks to Miss Marple's gentle questioning. But her story hadn't changed, and that troubled the old woman. It was too consistent, too polished, as if rehearsed. Miss Marple didn't doubt that Clara had seen the body. She was too shaken for that. But there was something she wasn't saying, something buried beneath her fear. As the night deepened, the village seemed to close in on itself, the rain a curtain separating St. Mary's Hollow from the world. At the manor, Daniel, Reed, and Carter emerged from the chamber, their faces pale, their silence heavy with what they'd seen. The letter, the knife, the shrine, it was all connected. But how? And who had wielded the blade? Miss Marple, back at the inn, felt the threads tightening. The murder was no random act. It was a ritual, a message, and the killer was still out, there, watching, waiting. She glanced at Silas, at Clara, at the empty space where Eliza had been, and her mind began to trace the pattern. The shadows were whispering, and Miss Marple was listening. Chapter 4. The Locked Room. The rain had slowed to a drizzle by the time Constable Reed, Daniel Wren, and James Carter emerged from the eerie chamber beneath Haverford Manor, their lanterns casting long, wavering shadows across the stone walls. The air in the manor felt heavier now, as if the discovery of the hidden shrine had awakened something dormant in its ancient bones. Daniel's mind churned with images of the circle and crescent symbol, the stained stone table, the book he'd almost touched. He glanced at Carter, whose face was a mask of calm, but the stranger's hands were clenched, betraying a tension that matched Daniel's own. Reed, meanwhile, was all business, his notebook tucked away, his jaw set as he led them back to the study where Lord Haverford's body still lay. "We'll seal this room," Reed said, his voice gruff but unsteady. "No one in or out until I get word from the county inspector. And that place downstairs, not a word to anyone. Understood?" Daniel nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. The manor was a maze of secrets, and the locked room they'd found, the study itself, felt like the heart of it. Clara had said the door was ajar when she found the body, but something about that didn't sit right. Haverford was a recluse, a man who valued privacy above all else. Would he leave his study door open, even for a moment? And if not, how had the killer gotten in? Or out? Carter lingered near the desk, his eyes on the wax-sealed letter Reed had bagged as evidence. "You're sure that's safe?" he asked, his tone casual but edged with something Daniel couldn't place. A letter like that could be valuable to the wrong people. Reed's moustache twitched. "It's safe with me," he snapped. "And I don't need advice from a stranger. You've done your part. Now stay out of it." Carter raised his hands in mock surrender, but his gaze lingered on the evidence bag, and Daniel caught a flicker of something in his eyes. Hunger, perhaps, or fear. It was gone in an instant, replaced by that practiced neutrality. Daniel's instincts screamed that Carter knew more than he was letting on, but there was no time to press. Reed was already ushering them out. Locking the study door behind them with a heavy iron key, he slipped into his pocket. Back at the Green Willow Inn, the atmosphere had grown claustrophobic, the villagers' whispers weaving a web of suspicion that seemed to tighten with every passing minute. Miss Jane Marple sat by the fire, her knitting untouched now, her hands folded neatly in her lap as she observed the room. Clara Ashbourne was still there, her face pale but composed, answering questions from Mrs. Pym and Mr. Gibbs with a weary precision that only deepened Miss Marple's curiosity. The maid's story hadn't wavered, not by a single word, and that was precisely what troubled the old woman. Truth, in her experience, was rarely so polished. Silas, the groundskeeper, had barely moved, his massive frame a dark silhouette against the wall. His ale remained untouched, and his eyes, though fixed on the floor, seemed to miss nothing. Miss Marple noted the bulge in his coat pocket again, her mind turning over possibilities. A key? A weapon? Or something else entirely? She'd seen men like Silas before. Silent, watchful, carrying burdens that made them dangerous. But was he a killer, or merely a witness to something he couldn't yet speak of? Eliza Crane's absence weighed heavily on Miss Marple's thoughts. The seamstress had slipped out during the chaos, and no one had seen her since. Miss Marple had asked Tom Harrow to keep an eye out, but the barkeep was stretched thin, managing the crowd and calming tempers. Eliza's fear, her furtive glances at Silas, her hurried departure, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple was determined to find where they fit. The inn's door swung open, admitting a gust of damp air and the sodden figures of Daniel, Carter, and Constable Reed. The room fell silent, every eye turning to them. Reed's face was grim, his coat dripping onto the floor, and Daniel looked shaken, his green eyes wide with the weight of what he'd seen. Carter, as always, was unreadable, his satchel still slung across his shoulder, his movements deliberate as he took a seat in his usual corner. "Well?" Mrs. Pym demanded, her voice sharp with impatience. "Is it true? Is Haverford dead?" Reed raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "It's true," he said, his tone heavy. "Lord Haverford's been murdered, stabbed in his study. We've secured the scene, and I'll be sending for the county inspector at first light. Until then, I need everyone to stay calm and stay out of the manor." The room erupted in questions, voices overlapping in a cacophony of fear and curiosity. Who did it? Was it one of us? What about Clara's story? Reed weathered the storm, his answers curt and evasive, but Miss Marple's attention was on Daniel. The young man had retreated to the bar, his hands gripping the edge as if to anchor himself. She rose, her steps quiet but purposeful, and approached him. "You've seen something, haven't you, Mr. Wren?" she said softly, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Daniel started, his eyes meeting hers. There was no point in lying, not to her. "The study," he said, his voice low. "It's wrong. The door was locked, or it should have been. And there's a room under the manor with symbols and things I can't explain." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind was racing. "A room, you say? And symbols?" She paused, her gaze steady. "Tell me everything, my dear, every detail." Daniel hesitated, glancing at Carter, who was watching them from across the room. But Miss Marple's presence was disarming, her calm assurance pulling the words from him. He told her about the hidden staircase, the stone chamber, the table with its dark stains, the book with the circle and crescent symbol. He described the letter, the knife, the eerie silence of the manor, and almost as an afterthought, he mentioned the figure he'd seen at the gates that morning, a detail he hadn't shared with Reed or Carter. Miss Marple listened without interruption, her eyes never leaving his face. When he finished, she nodded, her lips pursing slightly. "You've done well to notice so much," she said. "But you must be careful, Mr. Wren. Curiosity is a fine thing, but it can lead you into dark places." Daniel swallowed, his throat dry. "You think the killer's still here, don't you?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, that St. Mary's Hollow is full of secrets, and Lord Haverford's death has pulled one of them into the light. The question is, who else is hiding in the shadows?" As Daniel processed her words, Miss Marple's attention shifted to Carter. The stranger was speaking quietly to Tom now, his satchel resting on the table, one hand never far from it. She noted the way he angled his body, shielding the bag from view, and the way his eyes flicked toward the door every few seconds. A man on edge, she thought, but not in the way a guilty man might be. Carter was searching for something, or someone. The night wore on, and Reed took statements from the villagers, his notebook filling with hurried scrawl. Clara repeated her story, her voice steadier now, but still laced with fear. Silas offered nothing, his silence a wall no one dared breach. Eliza Crane remained missing, her absence a growing concern that Reed promised to investigate come morning. But Miss Marple knew that morning might be too late. The killer had struck once, and the pattern was clear. This was no crime of passion, but a calculated act, tied to the symbols and secrets of the manor. As the crowd began to thin, the villagers retreating to their homes under Reed's stern orders, Miss Marple lingered at the inn. She approached Clara, who was preparing to leave, her blanket still draped over her shoulders. "One moment, my dear," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. "You mentioned the study door was ajar. Are you certain of that?" Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Yes," she said, though her voice wavered. I think so. It was open when I got there." "And the windows?" Miss Marple pressed. "Were they locked?" Clara frowned, her hands twisting the blanket. "I didn't check. I was too scared. Why does it matter?" "Oh, it may not," Miss Marple said with a smile. "But small things often do." She patted Clara's arm and let her go, her mind already turning over the implications. A locked room, an open door, a killer who left no trace, except for a letter and a knife, both marked with a symbol that spoke of something ancient and deliberate. Daniel, meanwhile, couldn't shake the image of the chamber. He slipped out of the inn, ignoring Reed's orders to stay put, and headed toward the village square. The rain had stopped, leaving the cobblestones slick and gleaming under the moon. He didn't know what he was looking for, but the manor pulled at him, its secrets a siren call he couldn't resist. As he passed the churchyard, a shadow moved, a figure, slight and hurried, disappearing behind the stone wall. His heart leapt. It was the same shape he'd seen at the manor gates. He was sure of it. He followed, his steps silent, his breath shallow. The figure moved quickly, weaving through the gravestones, and Daniel caught a glimpse of a grey shawl. Eliza Crane. His pulse raced as he closed the distance, but before he could call out, a hand clamped onto his shoulder, spinning him around. It was Carter, his face half lit by the moon, his eyes hard. "What are you doing, boy?" he hissed, his grip like iron. Daniel yanked free, his fear giving way to anger. "I could ask you the same thing. Why are you following me?" Carter's expression softened, but only slightly. "You're chasing shadows," he said, "and you're going to get yourself killed. Go home." But Daniel stood his ground, his eyes searching Carter's face. "You know something," said, "about the manor, the symbols, all of it. Who are you, really?" Carter's jaw tightened, and for a moment Daniel thought he might answer. But then the stranger stepped back, his satchel clutched tightly. "You're in over your head," he said. "Stay out of it or you'll regret it." As Carter vanished into the night, Daniel turned back to the churchyard, but Eliza was gone. The village was silent again, but the shadows seemed to whisper, their secrets growing louder with every passing hour. Back at the inn, Miss Marple sat alone, her mind tracing the threads of the locked room. The symbols, the missing seamstress. The puzzle was taking shape, and she knew one thing for certain. The killer was closer than anyone realized, and the next move was already in play. Chapter 5. Miss Marple's Arrival. The dawn broke over St. Mary's Hollow with a reluctant grey light, as if the sun itself hesitated to illuminate the village's secrets. The rain had left the cobblestones slick, and a thin mist clung to the hills, curling around the spire of the church and the looming silhouette of Haverford Manor. The village was quieter than usual, its rhythm disrupted by the murder of Lord Edwin Haverford, and the air carried a weight that pressed against every door and window. At the Green Willow Inn, the fire had burned low, and the few villagers who remained spoke in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward the door as if expecting the killer to walk through it. Miss Jane Marple had risen early, her small room at the inn tidy and unassuming, much like herself. She stood by the window now, her hands clasped behind her back, her sharp eyes tracing the village square below. From here she could see the bakery, where Mrs. Pym was already at work, her flour-dusted hands betraying her sleepless night. She could see the churchyard, its gravestones half hidden by the mist, and the road that led to the manor, where Constable Reed would soon be meeting the county inspector. But Miss Marple's mind was not on the village's surface. It was on the currents beneath, the threads of fear and deceit that had begun to unravel with Haverford's death. Her arrival in St. Mary's Hollow had been no accident, though she'd let the villagers believe it was a whim, a little holiday, as she'd told Tom Harrow. In truth, she'd been summoned by a letter, slipped into her handbag during a visit to her niece in London. The letter was unsigned, its handwriting elegant but hurried, and it spoke of a darkness in St. Mary's Hollow, a danger tied to Haverford Manor, to symbols and secrets that threatened to consume the village. "Come quickly," it had urged, "before it's too late." Miss Marple had come, not because she feared the warning, but because she trusted her instincts, and they had whispered of a puzzle worth solving. Now, as she watched the village wake, she felt the weight of that puzzle more keenly than ever. The locked room, the knife with its carved symbol, the sealed letter, the hidden chamber beneath the manor. These were not random pieces, but parts of a deliberate design. And then there were the people. Clara Ashbourne, whose story was too perfect. Silas, whose silence was a fortress. Eliza Crane, whose fear had driven her into the shadows. Daniel Wren, whose curiosity was both a gift and a danger. And James Carter, whose secrets were as tightly guarded as the satchel he carried. Each was a thread, and Miss Marple was determined to weave them together. She turned from the window, adjusting her hat with a practised hand, and made her way downstairs. The inn was nearly empty, save for Tom Harrow, who was sweeping the floor, his face etched with fatigue. He looked up as she approached, his eyes searching hers for some hint of reassurance. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, leaning on his broom. "Sleep at all?" "A little," she replied, her smile warm but guarded. "And you, Mr. Harrow? I imagine it was a long night." Tom snorted, shaking his head. "Long and strange. Never thought I'd see the day when murder came to St. Mary's Hollow. And now, with Eliza Crane missing, it's got folks on edge." "Missing?" Miss Marple's tone was mild, but her interest sharpened. "No one's seen her since last night, not a peep," Tom said. "Reed's got men looking, but with the manor to deal with, he's stretched thin. Poor Clara's holed up at her cousin's, says she's too scared to go back to work. Can't say I blame her." Miss Marple nodded, her mind turning over the details. Eliza's disappearance was no coincidence. It was a reaction, a flight from something or someone. "And Silas?" she asked. "Was he here late?" Tom's expression darkened. "Left just after you went upstairs. Didn't say a word as usual, but I saw him head toward the manor, not his cottage. Odd, that. Very odd," Miss Marple agreed, her voice thoughtful. "Might I trouble you for some tea, Mr. Harrow, and perhaps a moment of your time?" Tom set the broom aside and led her to a table near the fire, where he poured her a cup of tea from a steaming pot. As he sat, Miss Marple studied him, noting the lines of worry etched into his face. Tom was a man of the village, rooted here by years of listening and observing, and she sensed he knew more than he realized. "Mr. Harrow," she began, stirring her tea, "you've lived here a long time. You know the manor's history, its people. Tell me about Lord Haverford. What kind of man was he?" Tom hesitated, his fingers tapping the table. Hard to say, seeing as he kept to himself. Old money, older grudges. His father, the previous lord, was a hard man. Ruthless, some said. Edwin was different, quieter, but strange. Always reading, always writing, locking himself away in that study. Folks said he was obsessed with history, old rituals, that sort of thing. Never married, no children, just him and the manor, and Silas to keep the grounds. "And Clara?" Miss Marple prompted. "How did she come to work there?" "Clara's been at the manor since she was a girl," Tom said. "Her mother was a maid there before her. Loyal, Clara is, but nervous. Always jumping at shadows. Can't imagine what she's feeling now, finding him like that." Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never leaving Tom's face. "And the symbol, the circle and crescent moon. Have you seen it before?" Tom's hand stilled, his gaze dropping to the table. "Not in years," he said quietly. "But, yes, when I was a boy, there were stories, old stories about the manor and the land it sits on. Some said it was built on a pagan site, that the Haverfords kept certain traditions alive. The symbol was part of it, carved into stones, hidden in the woods. Most folks thought it was nonsense, but my gran, she believed, said it was a mark of something dark, something that shouldn't be disturbed." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her mind was racing. A pagan site, a symbol tied to rituals, a murder that felt like a sacrifice. This was no ordinary crime. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow," she said, her voice gentle. "You've been most helpful." As Tom returned to his work, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Daniel Wren. The young man's account of the hidden chamber had confirmed her suspicions. Haverford's death was tied to something ancient, something the manor had guarded for generations. But who had known enough to use that knowledge as a weapon? And why now? Outside the village was stirring, though the usual bustle was subdued. Daniel Wren stood at the edge of the square, his hands shoved deep in his pockets, his eyes fixed on the manor. He hadn't slept, his mind too full of the chamber, the symbols, and the figure he'd seen in the churchyard. Eliza Crane, he was certain. Carter's warning had only fueled his determination. If the stranger thought he could scare him off, he was mistaken. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps, light but deliberate. He turned to find Miss Marple approaching, her umbrella raised against the drizzle, her expression one of quiet resolve. "Good morning, Mr. Wren," she said. "I see you're an early riser, like myself." "Couldn't sleep," Daniel admitted, his voice rough. "Not after last night." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes searching his face. "You saw something in the churchyard, didn't you, after you left the inn?" Daniel's breath caught. How did she know? But there was no point in denying it, not to her. "Eliza Crane," he said. "I'm sure it was her. She was running, like she was scared. And then Carter showed up, told me to back off. He's hiding something, Miss Marple. I know it." "Very likely," she agreed, her tone thoughtful. "But Mr. Carter is not the only one with secrets. Tell me, Mr. Wren, have you ever been inside the manor? Before last night, I mean." Daniel shook his head. "Never. No one has, except Clara and Silas, and maybe Eliza, though I don't know why she'd be there." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Perhaps we should find out," she said. "Would you care to walk with me? I thought I might. Pay a visit to the manor. Purely out of curiosity, of course." Daniel hesitated, his instincts warring with his caution, but Miss Marple's calm assurance was infectious, and the chance to learn more was too tempting to resist. "All right," he said, "but Reed won't like it." "Oh, I dare say Constable Reed has enough on his plate," Miss Marple said, with a smile. "Besides, we shan't disturb anything. We're only observing." They set off toward the manor, the mist parting before them like a curtain. The gates were closed, but not locked, and Daniel pushed them open, the iron creaking. Under his touch, the manor loomed ahead, its windows dark, its presence almost sentient. Miss Marple moved with surprising agility, her umbrella tapping the ground, her eyes scanning every detail. The overgrown hedges, the uneven flagstones, the faint outline of a symbol carved into the gatepost, nearly hidden by ivy. Inside, the manor was as Daniel remembered, cold, silent, and oppressive. Reed had posted a young deputy at the entrance, but Miss Marple's disarming smile and vague mention of assisting the investigation were enough to gain them entry. They avoided the study, which was still sealed, and instead explored the ground floor, Miss Marple's steps unhurried but purposeful. In the library, she paused, her eyes on a shelf of leather-bound books, their spines embossed with the circle and crescent symbol. "Fascinating," she murmured, running a finger along the edge of a volume. "Lord Haverford was a scholar, it seems. But of what, exactly?" Daniel followed her gaze, his curiosity piqued. "Do you think these books are connected to the murder?" "Think," Miss Marple said, "that knowledge is a dangerous thing, Mr. Wren, especially when it's hidden." As they moved through the manor, Miss Marple noted other details. A locked door in the east wing, its keyhole scratched as if recently forced. A portrait of a stern-faced woman, her necklace bearing the same symbol. A faint stain on the floorboards, barely visible, but suspiciously dark. Each was a clue, a thread in the tapestry she was weaving. Their exploration was cut short by the arrival of Constable Reed and the county inspector, a brusque man named Hargrove, who was less than pleased to find them there. "What's this?" Hargrove demanded, his eyes narrowing at Miss Marple. "Civilians poking about a crime scene?" "Oh, merely satisfying an old woman's curiosity," Miss Marple said, her tone apologetic but firm. "We were just leaving." Reed shot Daniel a look, but Miss Marple's presence seemed to temper his anger. As they were escorted out, Daniel caught a glimpse of Carter lingering near the gates, his satchel clutched tightly, his eyes fixed on the manor. The stranger didn't approach, but his presence was a reminder that the puzzle was far from solved. Back in the village, Miss Marple parted ways with Daniel, urging him to rest, but knowing he wouldn't. She returned to the inn, her mind alive, with possibilities. The manor was a locked room in more ways than one, its secrets guarded by symbols and silence. But Miss Marple was patient, and she knew that even the strongest locks could be picked with the right key. As the village settled into an uneasy day, the whispers grew louder. Eliza was still missing. Clara's story was beginning to fray at the edges, and Silas had been seen near the manor again, his coat pocket still bulging. Carter, meanwhile, had retreated to his room, but not before Tom noticed a piece of paper slip from his satchel. A map, perhaps, or a diagram, marked with the circle and crescent symbol. Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed, her eyes distant but sharp. The killer was close, their motives tied to the manor's past and the secrets it held. The locked room was only the beginning, and Miss Marple was ready to open the next door. Chapter 6. Secrets of the Manor. The mist over St. Mary's Hollow thickened as the morning wore on, wrapping the village in a shroud that muffled sound and blurred edges. Haverford Manor stood at the heart of it, its stone walls glistening with damp, its windows like blind eyes staring into the fog. The news of Lord Edwin Haverford's murder had spread like wildfire, and though the villagers went about their tasks, baking bread, tending livestock, sweeping shop floors, their movements were mechanical, their thoughts consumed by the shadow of the manor. Fear had taken root, and with it suspicion, each neighbour eyeing the other as if the killer might be standing in plain sight. Miss Jane Marple sat at a small table in the Green Willow Inn, her tea cooling untouched, her knitting, needle silent for once. Her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the clues that had begun to pile up like leaves in autumn. The circle and crescent symbol, the locked study, the hidden chamber, the missing Eliza Crane. The manor was the key. She was certain of it. Not just the scene of the crime, but the source of its motive. Lord Haverford's death was no random act of violence. It was a thread pulled from a tapestry of secrets woven long before the village was born. Tom Harrow approached, wiping his hands on his apron, his face drawn from another sleepless night. "Inspector Hargrove's up at the manor," he said, keeping his voice low. "Brought a whole team from the county. They're tearing the place apart, or so I hear." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes distant but sharp. "As they should," she said. "But I wonder, Mr. Harrow, if they'll find what matters most. The manor keeps its secrets well." Tom frowned, leaning closer. You think there's more to find? More than that? Room Daniel mentioned. Oh, I'm quite certain, Miss Marple said, her tone mild but laced with conviction. A house like that doesn't yield its truths easily, but they're there, Mr. Harrow, hidden in plain sight for those who know where to look. Tom hesitated, then glanced toward the door, ensuring no one was listening. There's talk, he said, almost a whisper, about Silas. Folks say he's been seen at odd hours, not just at the manor, but in the woods, near the old stones. Some think he's mixed up in this, maybe even the one who did it. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Silas is a man of few words, she said, but many shadows. We mustn't rush to judgment, Mr. Harrow. Accusations are like stones. Once thrown, they're hard to recall. Tom nodded, though his unease lingered. As he returned to the bar, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Daniel Wren. The young man's curiosity was a double-edged sword, sharp enough to cut through lies, but reckless enough to draw blood. She'd warned him to be careful, but she knew he wouldn't listen. Not yet. And then there was James Carter, the stranger whose every move seemed calculated, his satchel a Pandora's box she longed to open. The pieces were there, but the pattern was still elusive, like a melody half heard in the wind. Across the village, Daniel stood at the edge of the manor's grounds, hidden by a copse of gnarled oaks. He'd slipped away from home, ignoring his mother's protests, driven by a need to understand what he'd seen. The chamber, the symbols, the figure in the churchyard. The manor pulled at him, its secrets a challenge he couldn't resist. He'd heard about Inspector Hargrove's arrival, the cordon of police around the manor, but he wasn't here to cross their lines. He was here for answers, and he had a hunch where to find them. The manor's grounds were vast, overgrown with brambles and dotted with ancient stones, some bearing the faint outline of the circle and crescent symbol. Daniel had noticed them as a boy, dismissed them as old carvings, but now they seemed to pulse with meaning. He moved carefully, avoiding the patrolling deputies, until he reached a low wall near the manor's west wing. There, half hidden by ivy, was a door, small, weathered, and locked. But the lock was new, its brass gleaming in contrast to the crumbling stone, and Daniel's pulse quickened. Why replace a lock on a forgotten door unless there was something to hide? He crouched, examining the ground. The earth was soft from the rain, and there were footprints, several sets, some fresh, some older, but one stood out. A small, narrow print, like a woman's boot. Eliza Crane? His mind flashed to the churchyard, the grey shawl, the figure running from shadows. He needed to get inside, but the lock was sturdy, and he had no key. Frustration gnawed at him until a rustle in the bushes made him freeze. Looking for something, a voice said low and sharp. Daniel spun, his heart in his throat, to find James Carter standing a few paces away, his satchel slung over his shoulder, his eyes hard but curious. The stranger's coat was damp, as if he'd been out in the mist for hours, and his hand rested lightly on something in his pocket, a knife, perhaps, or something worse. "What are you doing here?" Daniel shot back, his voice steadier than he felt. "Following me again?" Carter's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "You're predictable, Wren. Always chasing trouble. That door's no good to you without a key, and even if you had one, you'd wish you didn't. Daniel bristled, stepping closer. You know what's behind it, don't you? You've known all along about the manor, the symbols, everything. Carter's expression didn't change, but his eyes flickered just for a moment. You're half right, he said, but you're asking the wrong questions. It's not what's behind the door, it's who wants it opened. Before Daniel could press further, a shout rang out from the manor. Oi, who's there? A deputy's lantern swung toward them, its light cutting through the mist. Carter grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him behind the wall with a speed that left no room for argument. They crouched silent as the deputy's footsteps crunched closer, then faded. Stay out of this, Carter whispered, his voice low and urgent. For your own sake. Then he was gone, melting into the mist like a ghost, leaving Daniel alone with his racing thoughts. At the manor, Inspector Hargrove was a whirlwind of efficiency, barking orders to his team as they catalogued evidence. The study was still sealed, but they'd found other anomalies. A hidden panel in the library containing letters written in a code no one could yet decipher. A set of keys in Haverford's desk, one of which matched the lock on the west wing, Dr. Daniel had found, and most troubling, a second bloodstain, faint but unmistakable, in the manor's attic. It wasn't Haverford's. Tests would later confirm it belonged to someone else, though who, they couldn't say. Constable Reed, relegated to assisting Hargrove, felt out of his depth. The manor was no longer just a crime scene. It was a labyrinth, each discovery raising more questions than answers. He confided as much to Miss Marple when she appeared at the manor's gates, her umbrella raised against the drizzle, her expression one of polite curiosity. Miss Marple, Reed said, his moustache twitching with irritation. This is no place for you. Hargrove's got everything under control. Oh, I'm sure he does, Miss Marple said, her smile disarming. But I thought I might offer a small observation or two. You see, I've been thinking about the study door, the one Clara found ajar. Reed frowned, caught off guard. What about it? Well, Miss Marple said, her tone almost apologetic, it strikes me as odd that a man like Lord Haverford, so private, so cautious, would leave his study unlocked, and yet Clara was quite certain the door was open. Have you considered, Constable, that the door might have been locked when the killer entered, and unlocked afterward? Reed's eyes narrowed, his mind turning over the idea. You're saying the killer had a key? Or access to one, Miss Marple said, and if they did, they knew the manor well. Perhaps better than we realize. Reed grunted, but her words stuck with him. He let her pass, ostensibly to have a quick look at the manor's grounds, though he suspected she'd see more in 5 minutes than his deputies had in hours. Miss Marple moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the flagstones, the hedges, the carvings on the walls. She paused at the west wing door Daniel had found, noting the fresh lock and the footprints, small, narrow, and hurried. Her lips pursed. Eliza Crane was no longer just missing. She was a key to the manor's secrets. Inside the village, Clara Ashbourne had emerged from her cousin's cottage, her face pale but resolute. She'd agreed to speak with Hargrove, to walk through her story again, but her hands trembled as she approached the manor. Miss Marple, returning from her walk, saw her and intercepted her gently, her voice soft but probing. "My dear," Miss Marple said, "you've been so brave. But there's one thing I'm curious about. The letter on the desk, the one with the wax seal. Did you notice anything about it? A name, perhaps, or an address?" Clara's eyes widened, her breath catching. I didn't look closely," she said too quickly. "It was just there on the desk. I was too scared to notice." "Anything else?" Miss Marple nodded, her smile reassuring, but her mind sharp. Clara was lying. Not about the letter's existence, but about what she'd seen. The maid knew more than she was saying, and that knowledge was a weight she carried alone. As Clara hurried off, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Silas. The groundskeeper had been seen again, this time near the old stones in the woods, his coat pockets still bulging. She'd asked Tom to keep watch, and he'd reported that Silas had returned to his cottage briefly, only to leave again, heading toward the manor's rear entrance. Miss Marple decided it was time to speak with him, but she'd need to be careful. Silas was not a man to be cornered lightly. Daniel, meanwhile, had returned to the village, his encounter with Carter burning in his mind. He found Miss Marple at the inn and recounted everything. The door, the footprints, Carter's cryptic words. "He knows what's going on," Daniel said, his voice tight with frustration. "He's part of it, I'm sure." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her tone thoughtful. "But Mr. Carter is a piece of the puzzle, not the whole picture. We must look at the manor itself, Mr. Wren. Its secrets are older than any of us, and they're what drove the killer to act." That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the church, where the vicar, a nervous man named Mr. Lyle, was polishing the altar. She asked about the manor's history, about the symbols, about the stories Tom had mentioned. Mr. Lyle was reluctant, but her gentle persistence coaxed out a tale. The manor had been built on a site sacred to an ancient order, one that used the circle and crescent symbol in rituals long forgotten. The Haverfords, he said, had guarded that legacy, passing it down through generations, though whether out of duty or greed, he couldn't say. As Miss Marple left the church, she saw Silas, in the distance his figure unmistakable. He was heading toward the manor, a spade in one hand, his coat pocket still heavy. She followed at a distance, her steps silent, her mind racing. The manor's secrets were buried deep, but they were rising to the surface, and Silas, she suspected, held the key to one of them. Back at the inn, Carter sat alone, his satchel open for the first time. Inside was a notebook, its pages filled with sketches of the circle and crescent symbol, maps of the manor, and notes in a tight, precise hand. He closed it quickly as Tom approached, but not before the barkeep caught a glimpse of a name scrawled. In the margin, Eliza Crane. The day drew to a close, the mist thickening into fog, and St. Mary's Hollow seemed to shrink, its boundaries defined by the manor's shadow. Miss Marple knew the truth was close, but so was the danger. The killer had struck once, and the secrets of the manor, its symbols, its hidden rooms, its ancient legacy, were a flame that would draw them out again. As she sat by the fire, her knitting resumed. She felt the pattern taking shape, and she knew the next thread was about to snap. Chapter 7. The Vanishing Clue. The fog over St. Mary's Hollow hung like a veil, softening the village's edges but sharpening its unease. By midday, the air was thick with whispers, each villager's glance laced with suspicion as they passed one another in the square. Haverford Manor loomed in the distance, its presence a silent accusation, and the news of Lord Edwin Haverford's murder had twisted the village's rhythm into something jagged and unfamiliar. The county inspector, Hargrove, had set up a temporary command post at the manor, his men combing every room. But the answers they sought remained elusive, slipping through their fingers like the mist itself. Miss Jane Marple sat in the green, Willow Inn, her small table by the window offering a view of the village's comings and goings. Her knitting lay idle, her hands folded neatly, but her mind was a whirlwind of connections and possibilities. The circle and crescent symbol, the locked study, the hidden chamber, the missing Eliza Crane. These were not isolated fragments, but parts of a larger design, one that pointed to a motive buried deep in the manor's past. Her conversation with the vicar had confirmed her suspicions. The manor was built on a site tied to ancient rituals, and the Haverfords had guarded that legacy, perhaps at a cost greater than anyone realized. Tom Harrow approached, his face etched with the strain of the past 2 days. "They've found something," he said, keeping his voice low. "Up at the manor. Hargrove's men, I mean. Not sure what, but it's got them in a tizzy." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained serene. "Something? Unexpected, I presume?" Tom nodded, glancing over his shoulder. "Word is, it's a book, found in the library, hidden behind a false panel. Full of those symbols you mentioned, the circle and crescent. Hargrove's got it under lock and key, but one of his men let slip it's got names in it, names of folks from the village." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Names," she murmured. "How very interesting. Did this man say whose?" Tom shook his head. "Didn't hear, but it stirred things up. Folks are starting to point fingers, wondering who's tied to whatever Haverford was doing." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing. A book with names suggested a network, a conspiracy, or perhaps a record of those who knew the manor's secrets. And if it was hidden, it was valuable, valuable enough to kill for. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow," she said. "You've been most helpful, as always." As Tom returned to the bar, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Daniel Wren. The young man's encounter with James Carter near the west wing door had been troubling, not just for Carter's cryptic warnings, but for the footprints Daniel had found. Small, narrow, like a woman's. Eliza Crane was still missing, and her absence was a gap in the puzzle that Miss Marple couldn't ignore. Had Eliza fled out of fear, or was she hiding something, perhaps even the key to the murder itself? Daniel, meanwhile, was back at the manor's edge, unable to stay away despite Carter's threats. The fog gave him cover as he crept along the perimeter, his eyes scanning for any sign of the seamstress. The west wing door was still there, its new lock gleaming, but now there was something else. A scrap of fabric, grey and tattered, caught in the brambles nearby. Daniel's heart leapt. It matched Eliza's shawl. He was sure of it. He reached for it, but a rustle in the fog stopped him cold. "Wren!" a voice hissed, and Daniel spun to find Carter again, his figure half hidden by the mist. The stranger's eyes were hard, his satchel clutched tightly, but there was a new urgency in his posture, as if time was running out. "Stop following me!" Daniel snapped, his voice low but fierce. "I'm not afraid of you." "You should be," Carter said, stepping closer. "Not of me, but of what you're stumbling into. That door, that fabric, you're chasing a trail that's meant to be followed, and it leads nowhere good." Daniel's fists clenched. "If you know so much, why don't you tell me? What's behind that door? And what's in your satchel? I saw the map, Carter. The symbol. You're not just a traveller." Carter's jaw tightened, and for a moment Daniel thought he might strike. But then the stranger exhaled, his shoulders slumping slightly. "You're right," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm not just a traveller. But I'm not your enemy, Wren. I'm here to stop something. Something bigger than you can imagine. That book Hargrove found. It's only the beginning." Before Daniel could demand more, a shout from the manor broke the silence. "Who's out there?" a deputy called, his lantern cutting through the fog. Carter grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him into the shadows of an oak tree. "Not a word," he whispered, his grip like iron. The deputy passed, his light missing them by inches, and Carter released Daniel, his eyes burning with intensity. "Stay away from the manor," Carter said, "and if you see Eliza Crane, run the other way." Then he was gone, swallowed by the fog, leaving Daniel with the scrap of fabric and 1,000 questions. At the manor, Inspector Hargrove was indeed in a tizzy, though he'd never admit it. The book, bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and brittle, had been found behind a false panel in the library, just as Tom had heard. Its contents were a mix of cryptic notes, diagrams of the circle and crescent symbol, and most disturbingly, a list of names. Some were villagers, Clara Ashbourne, Silas, even Tom Harrow, but others were strangers, their roles unclear. Hargrove's team was cross-referencing them, but the book's true purpose remained a mystery, its text written in a code that defied quick translation. Constable Reed, hovering at Hargrove's elbow, felt the weight of the discovery like a physical burden. "Could be a ledger," he ventured, his voice low. "Maybe Haverford was keeping track of, I don't know, debts or secrets." Hargrove snorted, his eyes fixed on the book. "This isn't about debts, Reed. This is something else, something old. Look at the paper, the ink. Some of these pages are centuries old, and that symbol, it's everywhere." Reed's stomach twisted. He'd grown up hearing stories about the manor, about the stones in the woods, but he'd dismissed them as folklore. Now, with a body in the study and a book full of names, those stories felt all too real. "What about the letter?" he asked. "The one with the wax seal. Any luck with it?" Hargrove's face darkened. "That's the other thing," he said. "It's gone." "Gone?" Reed's voice rose, drawing glances from the deputies. "How? It was in the evidence bag." "I know," Hargrove snapped, "but it's not there now. Either someone took it, or it was never bagged properly. I've got men searching the manor, but if it's been stolen—" He didn't finish, but the implication was clear. A thief meant a mole, someone close to the investigation. Back at the inn, Miss Marple had heard about the book from Tom, but the news of the missing letter reached her through Mrs. Pym, who'd overheard a deputy muttering in the bakery. Miss Marple's mind seized on the detail, her thoughts racing. The letter, with its wax seal and circle and crescent symbol, was a clue too vital to vanish by accident. Someone had taken it. Someone who knew its importance. Clara? Silas? Carter? Or perhaps Eliza, whose absence was becoming more suspicious by the hour. Miss Marple decided it was time to act. She slipped out of the inn, her umbrella raised against the drizzle, and made her way to Silas's cottage, a low stone building at the village's edge. The groundskeeper was there, sitting on a bench outside, sharpening a spade with slow, deliberate strokes. His coat hung on a hook, its pocket no longer bulging, and Miss Marple noted the absence with interest. "Good afternoon, Silas," she said, her voice warm but firm. "Might I have a word?" Silas didn't look up, his hands steady on the blade. "Ain't much for words," he grunted. But he didn't tell her to leave, which was as close to an invitation as she'd get. Miss Marple sat on the bench, undeterred by his silence. "I've been thinking about the manor," she said, her tone conversational. "It's a remarkable place, isn't it? So full of history. I understand you've worked there a long time. You must know its secrets better than most." Silas's hands paused, just for a moment, before resuming their work. "Secrets ain't mine to tell," he said, his voice low and rough. "Lord, Haverford's dead. That's all you need to know." "Oh, but I think there's more," Miss Marple said, her eyes never leaving his face. "A book, for instance, with names and symbols, or a letter sealed with wax that's gone missing, or perhaps a door in the west wing with a new lock and footprints nearby. You've seen things, Silas, haven't you?" Silas's eyes flicked to hers, dark and unreadable, and for a moment she thought he might bolt. But then he leaned back, the spade resting across his knees. "You're a meddler," he said, not unkindly. "But you're right. I've seen things. Too many things. That manor, it's cursed. Always has been. Haverford thought he could control it, but he was wrong." Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but probing. "Control what, Silas? The rituals? The symbols? Or something else?" Silas's jaw tightened, and he looked away, his gaze fixed on the fog. "Ask your questions elsewhere," he said. "I ain't the one you're after." Miss Marple nodded, sensing she'd pushed as far as she could. But as she rose to leave, she noticed something on the ground near the bench. A small silver object, half buried in the dirt. A key, its head engraved with the circle and crescent symbol. She didn't touch it, but her heart quickened. Silas hadn't seen it, or so she hoped, and she made a mental note to return later. In the village, Daniel had shown the scrap of fabric to Tom, who confirmed it matched Eliza's shawl. The barkeep's face had paled, and he'd urged Daniel to take it to read, but Daniel hesitated. The fabric was a clue, but to what? Eliza's flight, her fear, or something darker? He decided to keep it, at least for now, and headed to the churchyard, hoping to find traces of her path. There, among the gravestones, he found another clue. A piece of paper, crumpled and damp, tucked beneath a stone. It was a note, written in a hurried hand. "Meet me at the west door, midnight. Bring the key." No signature, no address, but the paper bore a faint watermark. The circle and crescent symbol. Daniel's pulse raced. The note was fresh, written since the rain stopped, which meant Eliza, or someone, was still active, still planning. He returned to the inn, intending to show the note to Miss Marple, but found her already there, her eyes bright with purpose. "Mr. Wren," she said, gesturing him to her table. You've found something, haven't you?" Daniel handed her the note, watching as she read it, her expression unreadable but intent. "A meeting," she murmured, "and a key. Most intriguing. Tell me, Mr. Wren, have you seen Silas today?" "Not since last night," Daniel said. "Why?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "Because I believe he's lost something," she said, "and I suspect it's tied to this note, and to the vanishing letter." As the fog deepened, the village seemed to hold its breath. The book, the letter, the key, the note, they were clues, but one had vanished, and the others were slipping away. Miss Marple knew the killer was watching, their next move already in motion. The manor's secrets were unravelling, and the truth was closer than ever. But so was the danger, lurking, in the fog, waiting for the midnight meeting to strike. Chapter 8. A Tangled Web. The fog over St. Mary's Hollow had settled into a dense, almost tangible presence by late afternoon, muffling the village's sounds and casting a dreamlike haze over its streets. The Green Willow Inn was a beacon inn, the gloom, its windows glowing with firelight. But the warmth inside did little to dispel the chill of suspicion that had taken root among the villagers. Every creak of the floorboards, every shadow in the corner, seemed to carry the weight of Lord Edwin Haverford's murder. And the discovery of the book with its list of names had only deepened the village's unease. Names meant connections, and connections meant betrayal. Someone, perhaps many, had been entangled in the manor's secrets. Miss Jane Marple sat at her usual table, her tea untouched, her eyes scanning the room with a quiet intensity. The note Daniel Wren had found in the churchyard lay folded in her handbag. Its words, "Meet me at the west door, midnight. Bring the key," etched in her memory. The key she'd seen near Silas's cottage, engraved with the circle and crescent symbol, was another piece of the puzzle. But it was the missing letter, stolen from Inspector Hargrove's evidence, that troubled her most. Its disappearance was no accident. It was a deliberate act, a thread pulled to unravel the investigation. The killer was not just cunning, they were desperate, and desperation made them dangerous. Tom Harrow approached, his apron streaked with flour from helping Mrs. Pym in the kitchen. "Hargrove's men are tearing their hair out," he said, keeping his voice low. "That letter's got them spooked. They're searching every inch of the manor, but it's like it vanished into thin air." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. "Things rarely vanish, Mr. Harrow," she said. "They're hidden or they're taken. The question is by whom and why." Tom frowned, his hands fidgeting with a rag. "You think it's one of us? Someone in the village? I think," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm, "that St. Mary's Hollow is a small place with big secrets. And secrets, Mr. Harrow, have a way of binding people together, whether they wish it or not." Tom nodded, his unease palpable, and returned to the bar. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the note and the midnight meeting. The west door, the key, the circle and crescent symbol. They pointed to a plan, a rendezvous that could reveal the killer's next move. But it was a trap, too, she was certain of it. The question was, who was the bait, and who was the hunter? Daniel Wren, meanwhile, was restless, pacing the village square despite the fog. The note burned in his pocket, its implications gnawing at him. He'd wanted to show it to Constable Reed, but Miss Marple's calm assurance had convinced him. to wait. She'd promised to devise a plan, but the hours were slipping away, and midnight loomed like a deadline. He couldn't shake the image of Eliza Crane's shawl, the footprints by the west door, or Carter's cryptic warnings. The stranger had been scarce today, spotted only briefly near the church, his satchel still clutched tightly. Daniel was certain Carter was tied to the note, perhaps even its author, but proving it was another matter. As Daniel passed the bakery, he caught sight of Clara Ashbourne, hurrying through the fog with a basket under her arm. Her face was pale, her eyes darting nervously, and she flinched when she saw him. "Daniel," she said, her voice strained, "what are you doing out here?" "Could ask you the same," he said, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "Thought you were staying with your cousin." "I am," Clara said quickly. "Just needed some air. And bread. For supper." She lifted the basket, but her hands trembled, and Daniel noticed a bulge beneath her shawl, too angular to be food. "You all right?" he asked, stepping closer. "You look scared, Clara. If you know something, you can tell me." Clara's eyes widened, and for a moment he thought she might bolt. But then she forced a smile, her voice brittle. "I'm fine, Daniel. Just shaken, like everyone. I'll see you later." She hurried off, disappearing into the fog, and Daniel's instinct screamed that she was hiding something tied to the manor, the note, or the missing letter. At the manor, Inspector Hargrove's team was indeed in disarray. The loss of the letter had cast doubt on their security, and Hargrove's temper was fraying. "Someone's playing us," he growled to Reed, pacing the manor's library. "That letter didn't walk off on its own. We've got a traitor in our ranks, or worse, in the village." Reed, his notebook clutched tightly, nodded grimly. "What about the book? Any progress on the code?" Hargrove's scowl deepened. "It's slow going. The symbols are part of it, but the text, it's like nothing I've seen. Old, maybe. Latin, maybe something else. We've sent copies to a scholar in London, but it'll take days. And those names, half the village is in there, but we don't know why. Could be a cult, a blackmail scheme, or just Haverford's madness." Reed's stomach churned. The idea of a cult in St. Mary's Hollow was unthinkable, but the evidence was mounting. The chamber, the symbols, the book. "What about Silas?" he asked. "He's been at the manor for years. If anyone knows what Haverford was up to, it's him." Hargrove snorted. "We've questioned him. Man's like a stone wall. Says he tended the grounds, nothing more. But I've got men watching him. If he's hiding something, we'll find it." Unbeknownst to Hargrove, Miss Marple was already one step ahead. After her encounter with Silas, she'd returned to his cottage under the pretense of retrieving a dropped glove. The key was still there, half buried in the dirt, and she'd carefully pocketed it, wrapping it in her handkerchief to avoid leaving prints. It was a risk, tampering with evidence, but Miss Marple knew the key was vital, not just to the west door, but to the web of connections tying the village to the manor. She sat now with Daniel, who'd found her at the inn, his face flushed with urgency. "Clara's hiding something," he said, keeping his voice low. "I saw her in the square, acting strange, and there was something under her shawl, something square, like a book or a box." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind seizing on the detail. "A box, you say? Or perhaps a letter?" She unfolded the note, studying it again. "This meeting at midnight, Mr. Wren. It's no coincidence that Clara is acting strangely, nor that the letter has vanished. We must be ready." "Ready for what?" Daniel asked, his frustration bubbling over. "You keep saying that, but what's the plan? We can't just wait for the killer to show up." Miss Marple's smile was faint but steady. "Oh, we won't wait, my dear. We'll be there, at the west door, before midnight. But we must be clever, Mr. Wren. The killer expects a meeting, but they won't expect us." Daniel's pulse quickened, a mix of fear and excitement. "You think it's a trap?" "I think," Miss Marple said, "that every trap is also an opportunity. Now tell me everything you saw when you met Clara. Every detail, no matter how small." As Daniel recounted the encounter, Miss Marple's mind wove the threads together. Clara's nervousness, the bulge under her shawl, the note's urgency, the key in her pocket. The tangled web was tightening, and the midnight meeting was the knot at its centre. But there were other players to consider. Silas, whose silence was a shield, Carter, whose satchel held secrets of its own, and Eliza, whose absence was a shadow over them all. That evening, Miss Marple slipped out of the inn, her umbrella raised against the fog, and made her way to the manor's edge. She moved with the quiet grace of someone who knew how to go unnoticed, her eyes scanning the grounds for any sign of movement. The west door was as Daniel had described, its lock gleaming, its frame half hidden by ivy. She tested the key, and it turned with a soft click, the door creaking open to reveal a dark, narrow passage. She didn't enter, not yet, but the discovery confirmed her suspicions. The door was a gateway, not just to the manor, but to its deepest secrets. Back at the inn, Carter was restless, his satchel open on his table, its contents partially visible to Tom's sharp eyes. The barkeep had seen the map again, its edges marked with the circle and crescent symbol, and now a new detail, a sketch of the west door, annotated with times and dates. Tom didn't confront Carter, but he passed the information to Miss Marple. When she returned, her face calm, but her mind alight with possibilities. "Carter's planning something," Tom said, his voice low. "That sketch, it's the west door, I'm sure of it. And those times, one of them's midnight." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts racing. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow. You've given me exactly what I needed." As the clock ticked toward midnight, the village seemed to hold its breath. Daniel, under Miss Marple's instructions, had enlisted Tom's help to keep watch on Silas and Clara, while Miss Marple prepared to confront the mystery at the west door. The key was in her pocket, the note in her handbag, and her mind was sharp with anticipation. The tangled web was about to unravel, but not without a struggle. In the fog, Silas moved silently, his spade left behind, his coat pocket empty, but his purpose clear. Clara, too, was on the move, her shawl concealing the object she'd carried earlier, a small sealed box, its wax bearing the circle and crescent symbol. Carter was already at the manor, hidden in the shadows, his satchel open, a knife gleaming in his hand, and somewhere, in the mist, Eliza Crane watched, her fear giving way to resolve. Miss Marple stood at the manor's edge, Daniel at her side, the fog swirling around them. "Be ready, Mr. Wren," she whispered. "The truth is close, but so is the danger? The clock struck 11, and the web tightened. The midnight meeting was moments away, and with it the chance to catch a killer, or become their next victim. Chapter 9. The Night of the Storm. The fog over St. Mary's Hollow had begun to lift as evening fell, but a new menace was brewing in its place. A storm, its first rumbles echoing across the hills, its clouds rolling in like a dark tide. The sheer air crackled with electricity, and the village, already taut with fear, seemed to brace itself for something more than rain. Haverford Manor stood defiant against the gathering tempest, its spires piercing the sky, its secrets locked within like a heart that refused to stop beating. The midnight meeting at the west door loomed, and with it the promise of answers, or bloodshed. Miss Jane Marple stood at the edge of the manor's grounds, her umbrella discarded, her sensible hat pinned tightly against the rising wind. Daniel Wren was beside her, his face pale but resolute. The note, "Meet me at the west door, midnight. Bring the key," clutched in his pocket. The key Miss Marple had found near Silas's cottage rested in her handbag, its circle and crescent symbol a silent accusation. The storm was no coincidence, she thought. It was a backdrop, a curtain for the drama about to unfold. The killer was close, their web of secrets fraying, and tonight Miss Marple intended to cut the final threads. "You're sure about this?" Daniel whispered, his voice nearly lost in the wind. "It's a trap. You said so yourself." "Oh, it's certainly a trap," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but firm. "But traps, Mr. Wren, are often the best way to catch a hunter. We must be cautious, but we must also be bold." Daniel nodded, though his stomach churned. The manor loomed before them, its windows dark except for the occasional flicker of lantern light from Inspector Hargrove's team, still searching for the missing letter. The west door was just ahead, its ivy-draped frame barely visible in the gloom. Miss Marple had instructed Tom Harrow to watch Silas and Clara, and to alert Constable Reed if either made a move toward the manor. But Tom had reported something troubling. Clara had slipped out of her cousin's cottage an hour ago, carrying a small sealed box, and Silas had been seen near the old stones, his spade in hand, his expression unreadable. At the Green Willow Inn, the atmosphere was stifling. The villagers huddled around tables, their voices low but urgent. The storm had driven most indoors, but the fear of the murder, and the book with its list of names, kept them talking. Mrs. Pym, her flour-dusted hands trembling, muttered about curses and pagan rites, while Mr. Gibbs, the wiry farmer, speculated that Silas was the killer, his silence proof of guilt. Tom Harrow listened, his face impassive, but his eyes kept drifting to the door, waiting for news from Miss Marple or Daniel. He'd seen James Carter earlier, slipping out with his satchel, and the sight had left him uneasy. Carter's sketch of the west door, the circle and crescent symbol, the name Eliza Crane in his notebook. They were pieces of a puzzle Tom couldn't solve, but he trusted Miss Marple to make sense of them. Outside, the storm grew fiercer, lightning splitting the sky, illuminating the manor's jagged silhouette. Miss Marple and Daniel crouched behind a low wall, their eyes fixed on the west door. The key in Miss Marple's handbag felt heavier now, its purpose unclear but vital. She'd tested it earlier, confirming it opened the door, but she hadn't ventured inside. Not yet. The passage beyond was dark, its air heavy with the scent of damp stone, and something older, more sinister. Tonight, she suspected, that passage would reveal its secrets. 10 minutes to midnight, Daniel whispered, checking his watch. What if no one comes? Someone will come, Miss Marple said, her voice steady. The note was specific. Mr. Wren. Whoever wrote it has a purpose, and they won't let a storm stop them. As if on cue, a figure emerged from the shadows, moving swiftly toward the west door. The lightning flashed, revealing a slight frame, a grey shawl, and a face pale with fear. Eliza Crane. Daniel's breath caught, his hand tightening on Miss Marple's arm. "It's her," he hissed. "She's alive." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, her mind racing. Eliza's presence confirmed her suspicions, but it raised new questions. Why was she here at the exact time and place specified in the note? And where had she been hiding since her disappearance? The seamstress fumbled with the door, her hands shaking, but it was locked and she had no key. She glanced around, her movements frantic, as if expecting someone or something. Before Miss Marple could act, another figure appeared, larger, slower, unmistakable. Silas, his coat flapping in the wind, his spade slung over his shoulder. Eliza froze, her eyes wide with terror, and for a moment the two stood locked in a silent tableau, the storm roaring around them. Then Silas spoke, his voice low but carrying, over the wind. "You shouldn't be here, Eliza. You know what's at stake." Eliza's voice was a trembling whisper. "I had to come. The note, it said to bring the key. I thought it was from you." Silas's face darkened, and he took a step closer. "I didn't write no note. You've been played, girl. Now get out before—" A third figure emerged, cutting Silas off. James Carter, his satchel slung across his back, a knife gleaming in his hand. The lightning flashed again, casting his face in stark relief. Hard, determined, but not cruel. "Drop the spade, Silas," he said, his voice steady. "And you, Eliza, step away from the door." Daniel's heart pounded, his mind reeling. Carter, Eliza, Silas, all here, all tied to the note. But who had written it? And where was Clara, with her sealed box? He glanced at Miss Marple, expecting her to intervene, but she remained still, her eyes fixed on the scene, her expression one of quiet calculation. Eliza's voice broke the tension, shrill with panic. "I don't have the key. I swear I thought Silas sent the note. I only came to stop it, to stop them." "Them?" Carter's eyes narrowed, his knife steady. "Who's them, Eliza? Talk or this gets messy." Silas growled, his spade raised like a weapon. "Enough games, Carter. You're no stranger to this. That satchel of yours, it's got more secrets than the manor." Carter's lips twitched, almost a smile. "Maybe, but I'm not the one digging holes in the woods at midnight. What's buried out there, Silas? Another body." The accusation hung in the air, electric as the storm. Eliza whimpered, backing against the door, while Silas's grip on the spade tightened. Miss Marple chose that moment to step forward, her voice cutting through the chaos like a bell. "Gentlemen, Miss Crane," she said, her tone calm but commanding. "I believe we're all here for the same reason, to find the truth. Shall we discuss it, or continue threatening each other in the rain?" The trio froze, startled by her presence. Daniel followed, his heart in his throat. But Miss Marple's calm was infectious, steadying him. Carter lowered his knife, though his eyes remained wary. Silas hesitated, then let the spade fall to his side. Eliza, trembling, nodded, her fear giving way to exhaustion. "Miss Marple," Carter said, his voice tight, "you're meddling in things you don't understand." "Oh, I understand more than you think, Mr. Carter," she replied, her smile faint but sharp. "For instance, I understand that this note," she produced it from her handbag, "was meant to bring us here, to this door, at this hour, and I understand that the key in my possession," she held it up, its symbol glinting in the lightning, "is what you're all after. Now, shall we open the door and see what's waiting?" Question hung in the air, heavy with possibility. Eliza's eyes widened, Silas's jaw clenched, and Carter's hand twitched toward his satchel. Before anyone could answer, a scream pierced the night, coming from the manor's rear. It was Clara, her voice raw with terror, and the sound snapped. "The group into action! Stay here," Miss Marple ordered Daniel, her voice firm. "Watch the door." She turned to the others. "We must find Clara. Whatever's happening, it's connected to this moment." They moved as a group, Carter leading with his knife, Silas and Eliza following. Miss Marple's steps, surprisingly swift. Daniel stayed behind, his eyes on the west door, but his mind was with Clara. The scream had been close, too close, and the storm's roar seemed to mock his fear. At the manor's rear, they found Clara, crumpled on the ground, her sealed box shattered beside her. Blood trickled from a gash on her temple, and her eyes were wide with shock. "It was him!" she gasped, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "He took it, the letter. He was here in the shadows." "Who?" Carter demanded, his knife raised, scanning the darkness. Clara's voice was a whisper, barely audible over the storm. "Haverford. Not Edwin. The other one." The name landed like a thunderclap. Impossible, but undeniable. Edwin Haverford was dead, his body still in the study. Another Haverford. The group exchanged glances, their fear mingling with confusion. Miss Marple knelt beside Clara, her mind racing. "The letter," she said gently. "What was in it? Clara? You saw it, didn't you?" Clara nodded, tears mixing with the rain. "It was a will," she said. "Edwin's will. It named his heir, and it wasn't what anyone expected. That's why he was killed, to keep it secret." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed, the pieces falling into place. The will, the letter, the symbols, the book. They were all tied to succession, to power, to the manor's ancient legacy. But who was this other Haverford? And why had they attacked Clara? As the storm raged, the group helped Clara to her feet, their urgency heightened by her revelation. The west door was still locked, the key in Miss Marple's hand, but the letter was gone, taken by a shadow who knew the manor's secrets. Silas's face was grim. Eliza's trembling had worsened, and Carter's knife gleamed with purpose. Miss Marple knew the truth was close, but the storm was not just outside. It was within them, driving each to their breaking point. Back at the west door, Daniel heard footsteps, soft but deliberate. He turned, expecting Miss Marple, but the figure was wrong, taller, cloaked, moving with a predator's grace. Lightning flashed, revealing a face he didn't recognize, but the eyes were cold, calculating, and fixed on the door. The figure held a knife, its handle carved with the circle and crescent symbol, and Daniel's heart stopped. "Who are you?" he demanded, his voice shaking but defiant. The figure didn't answer, but their smile was a blade in itself. A trio sheep. Storm roared and the night closed in. The manor's secrets poised to claim another victim. Chapter 10. Hidden Motives. The storm over St. Mary's Hollow raged with unrelenting fury, its thunder shaking the earth and its lightning tearing the sky apart. Haverford Manor stood as a dark sentinel, its walls battered by rain, its secrets pulsing like a living thing. The scream of Clara Ashbourne still echoed in Miss Jane Marple's ears as she led Silas, Eliza Crane, and James Carter through the manor's rear gardens, their lanterns barely piercing the torrential downpour. Clara, supported by Eliza, was shivering, her words about the other Haverford, and the stolen letter looping in Miss Marple's mind. The will, Clara had said, a document so explosive it had cost Lord Edwin Haverford his life. But who was this shadowy figure, and what motive drove them to such desperate acts? At the west door, Daniel Wren faced his own peril. The cloaked figure before him, knife gleaming with the circle and crescent symbol, moved closer, their silence more menacing than any threat. Daniel's heart pounded, his back pressed against the locked door, his mind racing for an escape. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steady despite his fear. "The key? I don't have it." The figure paused, their head tilting as if weighing his words. Lightning flashed, revealing a glimpse of their face, angular, unfamiliar, with eyes that burned with purpose. "You're in the way, boy," they said, their voice low, almost swallowed by the storm. "Step aside, or you'll end like Edwin." Daniel's blood ran cold, but before he could respond, a shout cut through the rain. "Wren!" It was Constable Reed, his lantern swinging as he ran toward them, 2 deputies at his heels. The cloaked figure hissed, their knife vanishing in 2, their cloak as they melted into the shadows, leaving Daniel gasping, his knees weak with relief. Reed reached him, his face a mix of anger and concern. "What the devil are you doing out here?" he barked, grabbing Daniel's arm. "And who was that?" "I don't know," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "They had a knife, same symbol as the one in Haverford's chest. They wanted the west door opened." Reed's eyes narrowed, his moustache twitching. "Get back to the inn now. This is no place for you." He turned to his deputies, barking orders to search the grounds, but the storm's chaos made pursuit futile. Daniel hesitated, torn between obedience and the need to find Miss Marple. But Reed's glare left no room for argument. Reluctantly, he headed toward the village, the stranger's words, "You'll end like Edwin," burning in his mind. At the manor's rear, Miss Marple's group had taken shelter in a crumbling gazebo, its roof leaking but offering some protection. Clara, her temple still bleeding, clung to Eliza, her story spilling out in frantic bursts. "The letter," she said, her voice hoarse. "It was Edwin's will. I saw it when I found him, before I ran. It named an heir, someone no one expected. Not family, not even a Haverford. It was someone from the village." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, though her expression remained calm. A villager?" she prompted gently. "Did you see the name, my dear?" Clara shook her head, tears mixing with the rain. "I didn't have time, but it was sealed with that symbol, the circle and crescent, and when I went back tonight to make sure, he was there. The other Haverford. He hit me, took the letter. I thought I was going to die." Silas, leaning against a post, grunted, his face unreadable, but his eyes dark with something like guilt. "Ain't no other Haverford," he said. "Edwin was the last. You're seeing ghosts, girl." But Eliza, her shawl sodden, shook her head fiercely. "She's not. I've seen him too, not his face, but his shadow. In the manor, in the woods. He's real, Silas, and you know it." Carter, his knife still in hand, watched the exchange with a predator's patience. "A shadow with a name," he said, his voice low, "and a motive. That it's the key, isn't it? Someone stood to gain everything, and they killed to keep it quiet." Miss Marple nodded, her mind weaving the threads together. "Indeed, Mr. Carter, a will naming a villager as heir would upend everything, wealth, power, the manor's legacy. But why hide it? And why the symbols, the rituals? There's more here than greed, I think." Carter's eyes flicked to her, a grudging respect in them. "You're close, Miss Marple, too close. That satchel of mine. You've been curious about it, haven't you? Maybe it's time you knew." He opened the satchel, pulling out a notebook and a small leather-bound journal, both marked with the circle and crescent symbol. "I'm no stranger to the manor," he said. "I was hired by Edwin Haverford himself months ago. He suspected someone was after his secrets, his legacy. This journal, it's his, written in code. It details the manor's history, the rituals, the order that guarded them, and the names of those involved." Silas stiffened, his hand tightening on the gazebo's rail. Eliza's breath hitched, and Clara's eyes widened. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice soft but probing. "And the notebook, Mr. Carter, what's in that?" Carter hesitated, then flipped it open, revealing maps, sketches, and lists. "My notes," he said, "tracking the symbols, the players." Eliza's name came up, not as a killer, but as a witness. She saw something she shouldn't have. Eliza's face crumpled, her voice barely audible. "I saw the book," she whispered. "In the manor, weeks ago. Edwin was writing in it, muttering about debts and promises. I didn't understand, but he saw me, and he threatened me. Said if I spoke, I'd regret it. That's why I ran." Miss Marple's mind raced. Eliza's fear, Clara's discovery, Carter's mission. They were all tied to the manor's hidden order, a legacy of power and sacrifice. But the other Haverford was the missing piece. "Silas," she said, turning to the groundskeeper, "you've worked at the manor for years. If there's another Haverford, you'd know. Who is he?" Silas's jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Ain't no Haverford," he repeated, but his voice lacked conviction. "Edwin was the last. The rest is lies." Miss Marple's gaze didn't waver. "Lies, perhaps, but truths are buried, Silas, and you've been digging. Those holes in the woods, what were you hiding?" Silas flinched, his silence louder than any confession. Before Miss Marple could press further, a crack of lightning illuminated the gardens, revealing a figure in the distance, cloaked, moving swiftly towards the west door. Carter's knife was out in an instant, his body tense. "That's him," he said. "The one Clara saw." "Stay with Clara," Miss Marple ordered Eliza, her voice sharp. "Silas, Mr. Carter, come with me." She moved with surprising speed, her small frame cutting through the rain, her mind locked on the figure. The west door was the key, and the stranger was its lock. At the inn, Daniel burst through the door, soaked and breathless, startling Tom Harrow and the few villagers still there. "Reed's at the manor," he gasped. "Someone tried to kill me at the west door. They had a knife, same as Haverford's." Tom's face paled, his hands gripping the bar. "Kill you? Who was it?" "I don't know," Daniel said, his voice shaking. "But they're after the key. Miss Marple's out there. She's got it. We need to help her." Tom hesitated, then grabbed his coat. "Stay here," he said. "I'll find Reed." But Daniel shook his head, his resolve hardening. He wasn't staying behind. Not now. Not when the truth was so close. Outside, Miss Marple, Carter, and Silas reached the west door, but the cloaked figure was gone, the lock untouched. The key in Miss Marple's hand felt like a burning coal, its weight pulling at her thoughts. "He was here," Carter said, his knife scanning the shadows. "He's watching us." "Then we must watch back," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but urgent. She inserted the key, the lock clicking open with a sound like a gunshot in the air. Storm. The door swung inward, revealing the dark passage she'd glimpsed before. Damp, narrow, smelling of earth and secrets. Silas hesitated, his face a mask of conflict. "You don't know what's down there," he said. "Some things are better left buried." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but the truth isn't one of them." She stepped inside, Carter at her side, his lantern casting flickering light on the stone walls. Silas followed reluctantly, his spade left behind, his hands clenched. The passage descended, its walls carved with the circle and crescent symbol, its air heavy with the weight of centuries. At its end was a chamber, not the one Daniel had found, but smaller, more intimate, its walls lined with shelves of ancient texts and artifacts. In the centre stood a pedestal, and on it a single object. A silver box, its lid engraved with the familiar symbol, its lock broken. Carter's breath caught. "The letter," he said, stepping forward. But Miss Marple's hand on his arm stopped him. "Not yet," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "This is too easy. The killer wanted us here. For a reason." As if in answer, a low laugh echoed from the shadows, and the cloaked figure stepped into the light. The knife was in their hand, its blade catching the lantern's glow, and their face, now visible, was one Miss Marple hadn't expected. A man middle-aged, with features that echoed Edwin Haverford's but sharper, hungrier. "You're clever, old woman," he said, his voice smooth but venomous. "But you're too late." Silas lunged, but the man was faster, his knife slashing Silas's arm, sending him to his knees. Carter raised his own blade, but Miss Marple's voice cut through the chaos. "Enough," she said, her tone commanding. "You're the heir, aren't you? The one named in the will. But why kill for it?" The man's smile was cold. "Because it's mine," he said. Edwin thought he could rewrite history, give it all to some village nobody. I took what was owed, his life, his legacy, and now I'll take yours." The storm roared outside, its thunder drowning out Silas's groan. Carter's curse, and Miss Marple's steady heartbeat. The chamber was a trap, the letter a lure, and the killer's motive, greed, vengeance, or something deeper, was laid bare. But Miss Marple wasn't finished. The web was tangled, but she held the key, and the night was far from over. Chapter 11. The Unseen Witness. The storm's fury battered Haverford Manor, its thunder rolling like a warning as rain lashed the ancient stone walls. Inside the hidden chamber beneath the west door, the air was thick with tension, the flickering, lantern light casting jagged shadows across the faces of Miss Jane Marple, James Carter, Silas, and the cloaked man who had just revealed himself as the killer. The silver box on the pedestal, its lock broken, stood as a silent witness to the confrontation. Its contents, the missing letter, Edwin Haverford's will, now in the killer's possession. Silas clutched his bleeding arm, his face pale but defiant while Carter's knife gleamed, his body coiled for action. Miss Marple, small and unassuming, stood at the centre of the storm, her eyes locked on the killer, her mind racing to unravel the final threads of the mystery. "You've gone to great lengths," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but piercing, "to claim what you believe is yours. But a will, sir, is a legal matter, not a prize to be won with blood. Why kill Edwin Haverford? And why now? The man, whose features bore a chilling resemblance to Edwin, though hardened by years of resentment, smiled, a cold predatory curve of his lips. "You're a curious one, aren't you?" he said, his knife steady in his hand. "Edwin was a fool, hoarding the manor's secrets, thinking he could rewrite the legacy. That will named a villager, a nobody, as his heir. My birthright. Stolen! I couldn't let it stand." "Your birthright?" Miss Marple prompted, her tone gentle but probing. "Then you are a Haverford, aren't you? A brother, perhaps, or a cousin, long thought gone?" The man's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. "Clever," he said. "I'm Roland Haverford, Edwin's younger brother, exiled years ago, disinherited for daring to question the family's traditions. But I never forgot. I watched, waited, and when I learned of the will, I acted. Edwin had to die, and the letter had to vanish." Carter's voice cut through the chamber, sharp and urgent. "You're not the only one watching," he said, his knife raised. "Someone else saw you, someone who's been hiding, waiting for this moment. Isn't that right, Eliza?" The name hung in the air, a spark in the darkness. Silas's head snapped up, his pain forgotten, while Roland's grip on the knife tightened. Miss Marple's eyes flicked to the shadows, where a faint rustle confirmed Carter's words. Eliza Crane stepped into the light, her grey shawl tattered, her face pale but resolute. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady as she spoke. "I saw you," she said, her eyes locked on Roland. "That night in the manor. I was there in the library, looking for something I'd lost. I saw you stab Edwin, saw you take the letter. I ran, hid, but I couldn't stay silent forever." Miss Marple's mind seized on the revelation, the pieces falling into place. Eliza, the unseen witness, had been the key all along. Her fear, her disappearance, her frantic flight through the churchyard. "You were protecting yourself," Miss Marple said softly. "But also someone else, weren't you, Miss Crane? The heir named in the will?" Eliza's breath hitched, her eyes filling with tears. "It was me," she whispered. "Edwin named me as his heir. I didn't ask for it, didn't want it. He said it was to right a wrong, to break the manor's curse. But I knew it would mean death. His, mine, maybe others." Roland's laugh was harsh, echoing off the stone walls. A seamstress? The heir to Haverford Manor? Edwin was mad, and you're a fool for believing him. That legacy is mine, and I'll kill anyone who stands in my way. Carter lunged, his knife aimed at Roland's chest, but the killer was faster, sidestepping and slashing Carter's forearm. The journal and notebook fell from Carter's satchel, skidding across the floor, and Silas roared, tackling Roland with a strength born of desperation. The chamber erupted in chaos, knives flashing, shouts mingling with the storm's thunder. Miss Marple stepped back, her eyes scanning the room, her mind calm amid the storm. She saw the silver box, its lid ajar, and the letter inside, crumpled, but intact. "Enough!" she cried, her voice cutting through the melee like a whip. The men froze, startled by the authority in her small frame. "Mr. Haverford, you've confessed to murder. The letter is here, and Miss Crane's testimony will seal your fate. Lay down your knife, or you'll only add to your crimes." Roland's eyes darted to the box, then to Eliza, then to the passage behind him. For a moment it seemed he might comply, but then he lunged for the letter, shoving Silas aside. Carter dove after him, but Miss Marple was quicker, snatching the letter from the box and tucking it into her handbag. Roland's knife slashed the air, missing her by inches, and he snarled, turning to flee down the passage. "Stop him!" Carter shouted, but Silas was on his feet, blood dripping from his arm, his massive frame blocking the exit. Roland hesitated, trapped, his eyes wild with desperation. Lightning flashed through a high window, illuminating the chamber, and in that moment Miss Marple saw something in Roland's face, not just greed, but fear. Fear of what the manor's secrets might reveal. Fear of the legacy he claimed but didn't fully understand. Outside, Daniel Wren had defied Constable Reed's orders, running back to the manor through the storm. He reached the west door just as Tom Harrow and Reed arrived, their lanterns cutting through the rain. "Miss Marple's in there," Daniel gasped, "with Carter and Silas and someone else. I saw them." Reed cursed, drawing his truncheon. "Stay back, Wren," he ordered. But Daniel was already at the door, pounding on it, shouting for Miss Marple. The lock was open, the key still in place, and Reed pushed past, leading the way into the passage. Tom followed, his face grim, while Daniel brought up the rear, his heart pounding with fear for the old woman who'd become his guide. Inside the chamber, the standoff continued. Roland's knife was raised, his back to the wall, while Carter and Silas circled, their injuries slowing them, but not stopping them. Eliza stood frozen, her eyes on Miss Marple, who held the letter like a shield. "You can't run forever, Mr. Haverford," Miss Marple said, her voice steady. "The manor's secrets are out, and the village knows. Give yourself up." Roland's laugh was bitter, almost unhinged. "The village? They're sheep, blind to the truth. The manor's power, its rituals, it's bigger than you, bigger than Edwin. You think this ends with me?" Before Miss Marple could respond, Reed's voice boomed from the passage. "Drop the knife now!" He stormed into the chamber, truncheon raised, Tom and Daniel behind him. Roland's eyes widened, his options dwindling, and in a final act of defiance, he lunged at Eliza, his knife aimed at her heart. Daniel acted without thinking, tackling Eliza to the ground, the blade grazing his shoulder. Reed and Carter moved, as one, pinning Roland to the floor, the knife skittering across the stone. Silas sank against the wall, his strength spent, while Miss Marple stepped forward, the letter still in her hand, her expression one of quiet triumph. "Constable Reed," she said, her voice calm, "I believe you have your killer. Mr. Roland, Haverford, brother to the late Lord Edwin, murdered him to claim the manor's legacy. Miss Crane is a witness, and this letter, the will, confirms the motive." Reed, panting, cuffed Roland's wrists, his face a mix of disbelief and relief. "You've got some explaining to do, Miss Marple," he said, but there was respect in his tone. "How did you know?" Miss Marple's smile was faint but knowing. "People, Constable, are not so different from villages. They hide their motives, but they leave traces, notes, keys, glances. Miss Crane was the unseen witness, watching from the shadows, just as the manor watched us all." As Roland was led away, cursing and struggling, Daniel helped Eliza to her feet, his shoulder stinging but his relief overwhelming. "You're safe now," he said, his voice soft. Eliza nodded, tears streaming down her face, her fear giving way to gratitude. Carter, nursing his arm, retrieved his journal and notebook, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "You're a dangerous woman," he said, a grudging smile tugging at his lips. "Edwin would have liked you, perhaps," Miss Marple said, "but I suspect he'd have preferred to live." The storm was easing now, its thunder fading to a distant growl. The chamber, once a crucible of secrets, felt lighter, as if the manor itself had exhaled. But Miss Marple knew the puzzle wasn't complete. The will named Eliza as heir. But what did that mean for the manor's rituals, its ancient order? And what of Silas, whose silence hid more than guilt? The unseen witness had spoken, but other voices remained silent, waiting in the shadows as the group emerged into the rain-soaked night. The manor loomed behind them, its secrets not fully spent. Miss Marple clutched the letter, her mind already tracing the next thread. The killer was caught, but the legacy of Haverford Manor was far from settled, and the village of St. Mary's Hollow would never be the same. Chapter 12. A Dangerous Revelation. The storm had passed, leaving St. Mary's Hollow drenched and subdued, its cobblestones gleaming under a pale, reluctant dawn. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wet earth and the faint tang of wood smoke, but the village felt hollow, as if the night's violence had carved out its heart. Haverford Manor stood silent, its windows reflecting the grey sky, its secrets no longer hidden but not yet fully understood. The capture of Roland Haverford, Edwin's exiled brother, had brought a murderer to justice. But the revelations in the hidden chamber, the will naming Eliza Crane as heir, the ancient rituals tied to the circle and crescent symbol, had left more questions than answers. Miss Jane Marple sat in the Green Willow Inn, her small table by the fire now a command post of sorts. The letter, Edwin Haverford's will, lay before her, its wax seal broken but its contents intact. She'd read it carefully, her sharp eyes tracing the elegant script that named Eliza, the village seamstress, as the sole heir to the manor, and its wealth. The document was a bombshell, not just for its choice of heir, but for its implications. Edwin had sought to break the manor's dark legacy, to sever its ties to the ancient order that had shaped its history. But the will was only one piece of the puzzle, and Miss Marple knew the truth was still unfolding, its edges sharp with danger. Tom Harrow approached, his face haggard from the night's chaos. "Village is buzzing," he said, setting a fresh pot of tea on her table. "Folks can't believe it. Roland Haverford, back from the dead, killing his own brother, and Eliza as heir. It's madness." Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Madness, perhaps, Mr. Harrow, but not without reason. Edwin's choice of heir was deliberate, a challenge to the manor's past. But there are others who know that past, others who may not welcome this change." Tom frowned, his hands fidgeting with his apron. "You mean Silas or Clara? They were both at the manor last night, mixed up in it all." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, but probing. "And Mr. Carter, too, with his journal and his secrets. The manor's legacy is a web, Mr. Harrow, and we've only untangled part of it. There's more to come, I fear." At the manor, Inspector Hargrove and Constable Reed were overseeing the aftermath. Roland Haverford was in custody, locked in a makeshift cell at the village hall, his knife and the stolen letter now key evidence. But Hargrove was uneasy, his brusque demeanour masking a growing realization that the case was far from closed. The book found in the library, with its list of names and cryptic code, had yet to be fully deciphered, and the hidden chamber beneath the west door suggested a deeper conspiracy. "This isn't just murder," he muttered to Reed, pacing the manor's library. "It's a bloody cult, or something close to it." Reed, his notebook filled with hurried scrawl, nodded grimly. "What about Eliza? If she's the heir, she's a target. Roland's locked up, but what if there's others?" Hargrove's scowl deepened. "We'll protect her, and we'll keep digging. That book, those names, it's the key. Someone else is pulling strings." Across the village, Daniel Wren was restless, his shoulder bandaged from the graze of Roland's knife. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the confrontation in the chamber, Eliza's confession, and the stranger's face, Roland, the other Haverford. He found Eliza at her cottage, her door guarded by a deputy, her face pale but resolute. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft as she let him in, "I didn't thank you for saving me last night." "You don't need to," Daniel said, his green eyes searching hers. "But you need to tell me the truth, Eliza. Why did Edwin choose you? And what's this about a curse?" Eliza hesitated, her hands twisting the hem of her shawl. "It's complicated," she said. "Edwin was kind to me years ago, when I was just a girl working at the manor. My mother was a maid there, like Clara's. Edwin said I was different, that I saw the manor for what it was, not what it pretended to be. He told me about the order, the rituals, the symbols. He said they were wrong, that they'd poisoned his family for centuries. He wanted to end it, to give the manor to someone who'd let it die." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Die? You mean sell it?" "No," Eliza said, her voice barely audible. destroy it, burn it down if need be. He thought the manor's power, its secrets, would only bring more death. That's why he named me heir, because I'd do what he couldn't. Daniel's stomach twisted, the weight of her words sinking in. And Roland knew? Eliza nodded. He must have. Edwin was afraid of him, said he'd come back one day. I didn't believe it until I saw him in the library that night. I ran, hid, but I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was James Carter, his satchel slung over his shoulder, his arm bandaged, but his eyes sharp. The deputy let him in, and Daniel tensed, his distrust of the stranger still strong. "What do you want?" he demanded. Carter's lips twitched, not quite a smile. "To talk," he said. "Miss Marple sent me. She thinks you're in danger, Eliza, and she's not wrong. That will, it's a spark, and there's still gunpowder out there." Eliza's face paled, but she nodded. "What does she want me to do?" "Stay visible," Carter said. "Don't hide. The more eyes on you, the safer you are. And tell the truth about everything. The manor's secrets can't hurt you if they're in the open." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "And what about you, Carter? What's your truth? You've been dodging questions since you got here." Carter's gaze met his, steady and unyielding. "Fair enough," he said. "I told Miss Marple last night, but you deserve to know. I'm a private investigator, hired by Edwin to protect his secrets and to find Roland. I failed on the first count, but I'm here to finish the job. That journal in my satchel? It's Edwin's, and it names others in the order, not just Roland. There's more at play, Wren, and it's not over." The revelation hit Daniel like a blow. A private investigator? It explained Carter's secrecy, his knowledge of the manor, but it raised new questions. Who else was in the order? And why hadn't Carter acted sooner? At the inn, Miss Marple was piecing together the same puzzle. She'd sent Carter to Eliza, knowing the seamstress needed protection, but her focus was on Silas. The groundskeeper had been released after the confrontation, his injury treated, but his silence was a wall Miss Marple intended to breach. She found him at his cottage, sitting on the bench outside, his spade leaning against the wall, his face etched with exhaustion. "Good morning, Silas," she said, her voice warm but firm. "I trust you're recovering." Silas grunted, his eyes fixed on the ground. "Well enough," he said. "What do you want, Miss Marple? Ain't nothing more to say." "Oh, I think there is," she said, sitting beside him. "You knew about Roland, didn't you? Not just his return, but his place in the order. You've been guarding the manor's secrets for years, perhaps out of loyalty, perhaps out of fear. But now, Silas, it's time to speak." Silas's hands clenched, his knuckles white. "You don't know what you're asking," he said, his voice low. "The manor, it's alive in a way. Its rituals, its power, they don't die with one man. Roland was part of it, but he wasn't alone. There's others still out there watching." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened, her mind seizing on his words. "Others in the order," she said. "Names in the book, perhaps. Or someone closer, someone in the village." Silas looked away, his silence a confirmation. Miss Marple pressed gently, her voice like a needle threading through fabric. "Clara, for instance. She knew about the will, saw the letter, Was she part of it, Silas, or was she just a pawn? Silas's jaw tightened, but he didn't answer. Miss Marple nodded, filing away his reaction. "Thank you, Silas," she said, rising. "You've helped more than you know." Back at the manor, Inspector Hargrove had made a breakthrough. One of his men, a young linguist, had partially decoded the book, revealing a chilling detail. The circle and crescent symbol was not just a mark, but a sigil, used in rituals to bind loyalty and silence. The names listed were initiates, sworn to protect the manor's legacy at any cost. Among them were Silas, Clara, and shockingly, Tom Harrow. Hargrove's face was grim as he shared the news with Reed. "We've got a nest of snakes," he said, "and they're not all in custody." Reed's stomach churned. Tom, the barkeep who'd served him ale for years? It was unthinkable, but the evidence was undeniable. "What do we do?" he asked. "Question them," Hargrove said, "all of them, and keep Eliza under guard. If she's the heir, she's the target." As the day wore on, the village buzzed with new rumours. Tom Harrow, summoned to the manor for questioning, maintained his innocence, claiming he'd known nothing of the order, that his name in the book was a mistake. Clara, still shaken, admitted to seeing the will, but swore she'd never been part of any rituals. Silas remained silent, his cottage now under watch. But Miss Marple, back at the inn, saw the pattern clearly. The order was fractured, its members turning on each other, and the will had been the spark that ignited their betrayal. She met with Daniel, Eliza, and Carter in the inn's private parlour, the letter on the table between them. "The manor's legacy is a poison," she said, her voice steady. "Edwin tried to end it, but he underestimated its hold. Roland was the first to act, but there are others, and they're watching. Miss Crane, you must decide. Will you accept the inheritance, knowing the danger?" Eliza's face was pale, but her voice was firm. "I'll accept it," she said, "not for the wealth, but to do what Edwin wanted, to end the manor's curse, whatever it takes." Daniel's eyes widened, a mix of admiration and fear. "You're sure they'll come for you?" "Let them," Eliza said, her resolve hardening. "I'm done hiding." Miss Marple nodded, her smile faint but approving. "Then we must be ready," she said. "The Order's secrets are out, and their next move will be desperate. Mr. Carter, your journal, may I see it?" Carter hesitated, then handed it over, his eyes wary. Miss Marple flipped through the pages, her fingers pausing on a list of names, some crossed out, others circled. One name stood out, written in fresh ink: Clara Ashbourne. "She's not just a witness," Miss Marple murmured. "She's a player." The revelation was dangerous, a spark in a powder keg. As the village settled into an uneasy evening, the manor's shadow loomed larger, its secrets no longer buried, but alive, hungry, and ready to strike. Miss Marple knew the final confrontation was coming, and the unseen witnesses, those still hiding in the Order's ranks, would soon step into the light. Chapter 13. The Final Puzzle. The dawn over St. Mary's Hollow was fragile, its light filtering through a sky still bruised from the storm. The village lay quiet, its streets empty save for the occasional clatter of a cart or the murmur of early risers, but beneath the surface tension simmered like a pot ready to boil over. Haverford Manor, its silhouette stark against the hills, seemed to watch the village with an unblinking gaze, its secrets no longer locked away, but scattered, waiting to be pieced together. The capture of Roland Haverford had brought a killer to justice, but the revelation of the manor's ancient order, its rituals, and the will naming Eliza Crane as heir had ignited a new fire, one that threatened to consume St. Mary's Hollow entirely. Miss Jane Marple sat in the Green Willow Inn, her small table now a battlefield of clues: Edwin Haverford's will, James Carter's journal, the decoded fragments of the book from the manor's library, and the key with its circle and crescent symbol. Her knitting lay untouched, her tea cold, but her mind was a whirlwind of connections, tracing the threads of motive, betrayal, and power that bound the village to the manor. The order's existence was no longer a rumour, but a fact. Its members, Silas, Clara, Tom Harrow, and others, entangled in a legacy of rituals that demanded loyalty and silence. Roland's arrest had fractured that loyalty, but Miss Marple knew the final piece of the puzzle was still missing. The true mastermind, the one who had orchestrated the murder and now pulled the strings from the shadows. Tom Harrow approached, his face drawn, his usual steadiness shaken by his summons to the manor for questioning. "They let me go," he said, his voice low as he set a fresh pot of tea before her. "Hargrove has got nothing on me, but my name in that book. It's got folks looking at me sideways." Miss Marple's eyes met his, kind but searching. "Names in a book are not proof, Mr. Harrow," she said, "but they are questions. Why were you listed, do you think? And what did you know of the manor's rituals?" Tom's hands clenched, his knuckles white. "I swear, Miss Marple, I knew nothing of rituals. My father worked the manor's grounds before Silas, and he'd tell stories. Old tales about the stones, the symbols. I thought they were just that, stories. If my name's in that book, it's because of him, not me." Miss Marple nodded, filing away his words. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow. Truth has a way of surfacing, even in the darkest waters." As Tom retreated, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Clara Ashbourne. Carter's journal had marked her as more than a witness, a player, perhaps even a leader in the order. Clara's story had been consistent, her fear genuine, but her knowledge of the will and her presence at the manor during the storm suggested a deeper role. Miss Marple needed to speak with her, but first she had another task: to confront Silas, whose silence was a fortress she was determined to breach. At the manor, Inspector Hargrove and Constable Reed were grappling with the book's decoded fragments. The linguist had made progress, revealing that the circle and crescent symbol was a sigil of binding, used to seal oaths within the order. The names listed were initiates, but one stood out, written in fresher ink: Clara Ashbourne. Hargrove's face was grim as he shared the discovery with Reed. "She's not just a maid," he said. "She's neck-deep in this. We need to bring her in, now." Reed nodded, his stomach churning. Clara, with her nervous demeanour and tearful confessions, had seemed a victim, not a conspirator. But the evidence was mounting, and the village was running out of time. "What about Eliza?" he asked. "If she's the heir, she's still a target." "Got a man on her cottage," Hargrove said. "But she's stubborn, won't leave the village. Says she's done hiding." Across the village, Daniel Wren was with Eliza, helping her sort through the implications of her inheritance. Her cottage was small but tidy, its walls lined with bolts of fabric and sketches of dresses, a stark contrast to the manor's opulence. Eliza sat at her table, her hands steady as she stitched a seam, her resolve hardened by the night's events. "I meant what I said," she told Daniel, her voice firm. "I'll take the manor, but not to keep it. Edwin wanted it ended. The rituals, the order, all of it. I'll do what he couldn't." Daniel's green eyes were wide with admiration, but shadowed with worry. "You're painting a target on your back," he said. "Roland's locked up, but Carter said there's others. And Clara, Miss Marple thinks she's involved." Eliza's needle paused, her face paling. "Clara? She's been kind to me, always. But she knew about the will. She saw it, same as me. If she's part of the order, why didn't she act before?" "Maybe she did," Daniel said, his mind racing. "Maybe she's been playing us all along." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was James Carter, his satchel lighter now that he'd shared his journal with Miss Marple, his eyes sharp with urgency. "Wren, Eliza," he said, stepping inside. "Miss Marple's at Silas's cottage, but she sent me to warn you. Hargrove's bringing Clara in for questioning. They found her name in the book, not just as an initiate, but as a keeper." "A keeper?" Daniel frowned. "What's that?" Carter's voice was low, grim. "The Order's inner circle. They guard the rituals, enforce the oaths. If Clara's a keeper, she's not just involved, she's running things." Eliza's hands trembled, the needle falling to the table. "Clara, running the Order? But she's so quiet, scared." "Scared people do desperate things," Carter said, "and desperate people kill." At Silas's cottage, Miss Marple sat across from the groundskeeper, her presence disarming but relentless. Silas was bandaged, his arm stiff from Roland's knife, but his silence was as stubborn as ever. The spade leaned against the wall, its blade clean but heavy with implication. "Silas," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm, "you've carried the manor's burdens for years. I understand loyalty, but it's time to unburden yourself. Clara Ashbourne, what is her role in the Order?" Silas's eyes flicked to hers, dark and haunted. "You don't stop, do you?" he muttered. "Clara, she's more than she seems, always has been. Her mother was a keeper, same as mine. We were born into it, raised to protect the manor's secrets. But Clara, she wanted more. Power, not just duty." Miss Marple's heart quickened, the puzzle's final piece sliding into place. "And Edwin's will threatened that power," she said. "By naming Eliza, he broke the Order's hold. Did Clara act alone, Silas? Or was she Roland's partner?" Silas's jaw clenched, his silence a confession. "She didn't wield the knife," he said at last. "But she planned it. Told Roland about the will, set him loose, thought she could control him, but he was a wild dog." Miss Marple nodded, her mind racing. Clara, the quiet maid, had orchestrated the murder, using Roland as her weapon. But why attack Clara during the storm? Was it a betrayal within the Order, or a staged act to deflect suspicion? The puzzle was nearly complete, but the danger was far from over. In the village, Hargrove's men had found Clara at her cousin's cottage, her face pale but composed. She went quietly, her hands folded, her eyes darting as if expecting rescue. At the manor, Hargrove questioned her in the library, the book open before him, its pages accusing. "You're a keeper," he said, his voice hard. "You knew about the rituals, the order. Did you kill Edwin Haverford?" Clara's voice was soft, almost childlike. "No," she said. "I loved Edwin. He was kind to me. But the will, it was wrong. The manor belongs to the order, not some seamstress." "Told Roland, yes, but I didn't know he'd kill." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, unconvinced. "And the letter? You took it, didn't you? During the storm, when you claimed you were attacked?" Clara's composure cracked, her hands trembling. I had to. It was proof of Eliza's claim. I thought if it was gone, the order could reclaim the manor." Miss Marple, arriving at the manor with Daniel and Carter, overheard the confession from the doorway. She stepped forward, her presence commanding despite her small stature. "Miss Ashbourne," she said, her voice calm but piercing, "you've played a dangerous game. You set Roland on Edwin, knowing his greed would lead to murder. But you underestimated him, didn't you? And now you've betrayed the order to save yourself." Clara's eyes widened, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she sobbed. "I just wanted to protect the manor, to keep it ours. The rituals, their power, Miss Marple, power you can't understand." Miss Marple's expression softened, but her eyes were unyielding. "Power built on blood is no power at all," she said. "You've lost, Clara. The will is legal, Eliza is the heir, and the order is finished." Hargrove cuffed Clara, his face grim as he led her away. Reed, watching from the sidelines, shook his head, the weight of the village's betrayal heavy on his shoulders. "How did you know?" he asked Miss Marple, his voice low. "People, Constable," she said, "are like puzzles. They're pieces, words, glances, silences, fit together if you look closely." Clara's fear was real, but her motives were hidden. She was the final piece. As Clara was taken to the village hall, Eliza arrived, flanked by Daniel and Carter. She faced Miss Marple, her resolve unshaken. "It's over, isn't it?" she asked. "The order, the rituals, they're done." "Not quite," Miss Marple said, her voice thoughtful. "The manor still stands, and its legacy lingers. You must be vigilant, Miss Crane. The order may be broken, but its echoes remain. The village settled into an uneasy calm. The puzzle solved, but its scars fresh. Roland and Clara would face trial. Silas's silence would be questioned, and Tom Harrow's name would linger in whispers. But Eliza, now the manor's heir, stood ready to fulfill Edwin's wish, to end the curse, to let the manor die. Miss Marple gathered her things, her work in St. Mary's Hollow nearly done. The final puzzle was complete, but she knew the village would carry its secrets for years to come. As she sipped her tea, her eyes distant but sharp, she felt the weight of the manor's legacy, and the faint stir of another mystery waiting in the shadows. Chapter 14. Shadows of the Past. The morning sun rose over St. Mary's Hollow, casting a golden glow that softened the village's scars, but could not erase them. The storm's wreckage, broken branches, flooded ditches, shattered windows, littered the streets, a reminder of the chaos that had unmasked a killer and fractured an ancient order. Haverford Manor stood on its hill, its silhouette less menacing in the daylight, but still heavy with the weight of its history. The arrests of Roland Haverford and Clara Ashbourne had brought a semblance of justice, but the village was far from healed, its trust shaken by the revelation of the manor's rituals and the names in the book that implicated neighbours and friends. Miss Jane Marple stood at the window of the Green Willow Inn, her small suitcase packed, her departure imminent. Her work in St. Mary's Hollow was done, or so it seemed, but her sharp eyes lingered on the village square, where life was slowly resuming. Mrs. Pym swept the bakery steps, her movements brisk but wary. Mr. Gibbs led his cows to pasture, his usual banter silenced. Children played, but their laughter was subdued, as if the manor's shadow still reached them. The will naming Eliza Crane as heir had changed everything, and Miss Marple knew the ripples would spread for years to come. Tom Harrow approached, his face etched with the strain of the past days. "You're leaving, then?" he asked, setting a tray of tea and scones on her table. "Village won't be the same without you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled, her expression warm but guarded. "Oh, I'm sure St. Mary's Hollow will find its way, Mr. Harrow. Villages are resilient, like people. They bend, but they rarely break." Tom hesitated, his hands fidgeting with his apron. "About that book," he said, his voice low. "My name. I swear I didn't know what it meant. My father's stories, they were just tales to me. But folks are still whispering, wondering if I'm part of it." Miss Marple's eyes met his, kind but piercing. "Whispers fade, Mr. Harrow, when truth takes their place. You've been honest, and that's enough. But do keep an eye on the manor, won't you? Its secrets may be out, but its shadows linger." Tom nodded, a flicker of relief in his eyes, and returned to the bar. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mind turning over the final threads of the case. Clara's confession had sealed her fate, but Silas's silence still troubled her. The groundskeeper had admitted to knowing about the order, to being born into its ranks, but he'd stopped short of naming others. Were there more keepers hiding in plain sight? And what of the book's remaining code, still undeciphered? The puzzle was solved, but its edges were frayed, hinting at a larger picture she couldn't yet see. At the manor, Inspector Hargrove was preparing to leave, his team packing up their equipment. The book, the knife, and the will were secured as evidence. But the linguist's work on the code was slow, and Hargrove's frustration was palpable. "This place is a cursed labyrinth," he muttered to Constable Reed, surveying the library's shelves. "We've got our killers, but I don't trust this village to stay quiet." Reed, his notebook tucked away, nodded grimly. "Eliza's the key now," he said. "If she follows through, burns the manor, ends the rituals, she might—" "Stop it! But she's got enemies, Hargrove. That order, it's not dead." Hargrove's scowl deepened. "Then we keep watch. I'm leaving a man here just in case. And Silas, he's not off the hook. He knows more than he's saying." In the village, Eliza Crane was at her cottage, her resolve unshaken despite the deputy stationed outside. Daniel Wren sat with her, his shoulder healing, his curiosity undimmed. James Carter had left at dawn, his role as Edwin's investigator complete, but he'd left Eliza his journal, its pages a map of the order's reach. "You're sure about this?" Daniel asked, watching her pack a small bag. "Taking on the manor, I mean. It's not just a house, It's something else. Eliza's eyes were steady, her fear replaced by purpose. I know, she said. That's why I have to do it. Edwin believed the manor's power could be broken, and he trusted me to try. I won't let him down. Daniel's admiration was tinged with worry. You'll need help, he said. I'm not letting you do this alone. Eliza smiled, a rare warmth in her face. I was hoping you'd say that. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Miss Marple, her hat pinned neatly, her suitcase in hand. Miss Crane, Mr. Wren, she said, stepping inside. I wanted to see you before I go. You've both been remarkably brave, but bravery alone won't be enough. The manor's legacy is a hydra. Cut off one head, and another grows. Eliza nodded, her resolve unwavering. I know the risks, Miss Marple, but I have the will, and I have allies. What do you suggest? Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her voice was firm. Transparency, my dear. The manor thrives on secrets. Make its history public, every ritual, every name. Let the village see it, judge it, and be cautious of those who stay silent like Silas. His loyalty to the order may not be broken. Daniel frowned, his mind flashing to the groundskeeper's cottage. You think Silas is still a threat? I think, Miss Marple said, that loyalty is a powerful thing, and Silas's runs deep. Watch him, Mr. Wren, but don't judge him too harshly. He's a man caught between worlds. Miss Marple handed Eliza a small card with her address, in St. Mary, Mead. Write to me, she said, if you need advice, or if the shadows grow too long. You're not alone, Miss Crane. Eliza took the card, her gratitude unspoken but clear. Thank you, she said, for everything. As Miss Marple left the cottage, she paused at the village square, her eyes drawn to the manor one last time. Silas was there, near the gates, his spade in hand, his gaze fixed on the ground. He didn't see her, but she saw him, the weight of his secrets, the conflict in his posture. She made a mental note to inform Hargrove, to ensure Silas was watched, but she also felt a pang of sympathy. Silas was a relic of the manor's past, bound by oaths he couldn't fully break. At the village hall, Roland and Clara awaited transport to the county jail, their fates sealed by their confessions. But Clara's words to Hargrove, spoken in a final tearful outburst, lingered. The order isn't finished. It's bigger than me, than Roland. You'll see. Hargrove dismissed it as desperation, but Miss Marple, hearing the report from Reed, knew better. The order's roots were deep, its branches hidden, and Eliza's mission would stir them to life. Miss Marple boarded the morning coach, her suitcase light but her thoughts heavy. The village of St. Mary's Hollow receded behind her, its secrets no longer hers to unravel. She'd solved the murder, exposed the order, and set Eliza on her path. But the shadows of the past were long, and she knew they'd reach beyond the village's borders. As the coach rattled away, Daniel and Eliza stood at the manor's gates, the will in her hand, their resolve a beacon against the unknown. Silas watched from a distance, his spade still, his eyes unreadable. Tom Harrow, back at the inn, poured ale for a quieter crowd, his name no longer whispered, but not forgotten. And somewhere, in the manor's depths, the books undeciphered, pages waited, their secrets a whisper of future storms. Miss Marple closed her eyes, the rhythm of the coach soothing her. The puzzle of St. Mary's Hollow was solved, but life, she knew, was a tapestry of puzzles, each thread leading to another. She smiled faintly, her mind already turning to the next mystery, wherever it might find her.